Hello and welcome. There are places in the world where time moves differently, where the veil between what is natural and what is eternal grows thin as morning mist. These are the sacred groves, the hidden sanctuaries where Druids have kept their vigils since before the first cities rose from bare earth. But not all vigils end in peace, and not all guardians find rest when their duty is done. Some remain, bound by oaths older than memory, cursed to protect what they can no longer recognize, to serve a purpose that has long since twisted into something unrecognizable. Tonight, we delve into tales that history has tried to forget. Stories whispered in the rustling of ancient leaves and carried on winds that remember when the world was young. These are the lost chronicles, the forgotten sagas that slip through the cracks of recorded history. Tonight, we begin with a Druid who loved too deeply, who held too tightly to what should have been allowed to change, and who paid a price that echoes still in the deepest forests of Faerun. Lore number 1, the Druid's Eternal Grove. In the Moonchi Isles, there exists a grove that no map shows, that no path leads to unless the forest itself wishes you to find it. The trees there grow in patterns that defy nature, their roots weaving symbols of power that predate even the oldest Druidic circles. The locals call it the Weeping Grove, though few remember why. Fewer still know the name of the one who tends it, the guardian who has walked those twisted paths for longer than any mortal lifespan should allow. Her name was Silith Greenbow, and once she was the most devoted servant of Sylvanus, the forest father that the Moonchi Isles had ever known. Silith came to her calling young, as many Druids do. She was barely 15 summers old when she first heard the song of the earth beneath her feet, felt the pulse of life flowing through root and branch. The Earth Mother spoke to her in the language of growing things, and Silith listened with a heart so open, so willing, that the natural world embraced her as one of its own. By her 20th year, she had mastered forms that took other Druids decades to learn. She could become the eagle, the bear, the wolf. She could call storms from clear skies and coax flowers from frozen ground. But her greatest gift was not in the magic she wielded. It was in her love for the wild places, her absolute devotion to preserving the balance between civilization and nature. When the first human settlers came to the northern reaches of Gwyneth, it was Silith who negotiated the boundaries, who showed them which lands they could farm and which must remain forever untouched. She was fair in her dealings, firm but not cruel, understanding that humans too had their place in the great cycle. The grove she tended was a place of profound beauty. Ancient oaks stood sentinel around a clear pool fed by an underground spring that had never run dry, not even in the worst droughts. Moonflowers bloomed there in every season, their silver petals glowing with a soft luminescence that needed no sun. The animals came there without fear, deer and rabbit, fox and badger, all dwelling in harmony within the grove's protective boundaries. It was a living temple, a manifestation of everything the Druids held sacred. For 40 years, Silith tended her grove with unwavering dedication. She never married, never left the forest for more than a few days at a time. The grove was her child, her lover, her life's purpose. She knew every tree by name, every stone and stream. She could feel the health of the land in her bones, could sense when the balance shifted, even slightly out of true. Then came the blight. It started small, as such things often do. A single oak at the eastern edge of the grove began to wither, its leaves turning brown before their time. Silith tried everything she knew, every healing spell, every prayer to Sylvanus. She mixed poultices from sacred herbs, poured blessed water on the roots, sat in meditation for days trying to understand what affliction had taken hold. Nothing worked. Within a month, the oak was dead, its branches bare and brittle. The blight spread. 2 more trees fell to the mysterious sickness, then 5, then a dozen. The animals began to flee the grove, sensing something wrong in the very soil. The moonflowers withered on their vines. The sacred pool grew clouded and stagnant. Silith watched her life's work crumbling around her, and the grief nearly drove her mad. She sought help from her circle, from the eldest druids who had trained her. They came and examined the grove, performed their own rituals and divinations. Their conclusion was one that Silith refused to accept. The land itself was dying, they said. Some fundamental shift in the Earth's energy, perhaps caused by the increasing human settlements, perhaps simply the natural end of a cycle that had lasted centuries. The grove could not be saved. The best thing to do, they counseled, was to let it die in peace, to allow the land to rest, and perhaps, in time, renew itself in a different form. Silith rejected their wisdom. She had devoted her entire life to this place. She had sacrificed everything for these trees, this pool, this sacred ground. She would not, could not, simply stand by and watch it die. If the natural order demanded the grove's end, then she would defy the natural order itself. She began to search for other answers, darker answers. She traveled to the forbidden places where the boundaries between the Feywild and the mortal world grew thin. She sought out the Archfey, those capricious and dangerous beings of pure nature magic who cared nothing for druidic balance. She made bargains, traded pieces of herself for knowledge that no druid should possess. She learned of rituals that could bind life force, that could anchor a place to existence through sheer magical will. The price for such knowledge was steep. The Archfey took her ability to assume her wild shapes, severing her connection to the animals she had once become. They took her name from the memories of everyone who had ever known her, making her a stranger even to her own circle. They took her youth, aging her body 30 years in a single night. But they gave her what she sought. They gave her the power to save her grove. The ritual required a sacrifice, not of blood or treasure, but of self. Silith would bind her own life force to the grove, become its anchor, its eternal guardian. As long as she remained, the grove would remain. The trees would not die, the pool would not dry, the flowers would bloom forever. It seemed a fair exchange to Silith. She had already given everything else to this place. Why not give her life as well, her very soul? On the night of the autumn equinox, beneath a moon so full and bright, it seemed to fill the entire sky, Silith performed the ritual. She carved symbols of binding into her own flesh with a knife of flint, painted her face with clay from the sacred pool, and spoke words in a language that predated the Druidic tongue. She felt the magic take hold, felt her essence flowing out of her body and into the earth, into the trees, into the very air of the grove. The effect was immediate. The dying trees surged with new life, their leaves unfurling in vibrant greens that glowed with unnatural vitality. The pool cleared, its waters running so pure they seemed like liquid crystal. The moonflowers bloomed in a riot of silver and white, more abundant than they had ever been. Silith laughed with joy and relief, tears streaming down her weathered face. She had saved her grove. She had won. But victory turned to horror as the days passed, and Silith began to understand the true nature of what she had done. The grove was alive, yes, but it was a false life, a mockery of the natural cycle. The trees did not grow. They remained exactly as they were, frozen in eternal stasis. No leaves fell in autumn. No new shoots emerged in spring. The animals that returned to the grove found no food there, for the plants bore no fruit, no seeds, nothing that could sustain life beyond the grove's borders. The pool was pure, but nothing could live in its waters. No fish, no insects, no algae. It was sterile, perfect, and utterly dead. And Silith herself had become part of this frozen moment. She could not leave the grove, could not step beyond its boundaries without feeling her life force begin to tear. A pain so intense it drove her to her knees. She did not age, did not sleep, did not hunger or thirst. She simply existed, walking the same paths day after day, tending trees that needed no tending, watching over a place that had become a beautiful tomb. Worse still, she began to realize that the grove was feeding on her. Not her body, but her memories, her emotions, her very sense of self. Each day, she remembered a little less of who she had been before. Names faded from her mind, faces blurred into obscurity. The reasons for her choices, the love that had driven her to such desperate measures, all of it slowly dissolved like morning, dew under a harsh sun. She tried to reverse the ritual, but the knowledge of how to do so was already gone, consumed by the grove's endless hunger. She called out to Sylvanus, begged for forgiveness, for release, but the forest father did not answer. She had placed herself beyond his reach, had violated the most fundamental principle of Druidic faith. She had tried to stop the cycle, to prevent death and change, and in doing so had created something that was neither truly alive nor completely dead. Centuries passed. The world beyond the grove changed and changed again. Kingdoms rose and fell. New gods were worshipped and old ones forgotten. The Moonshi Isles were invaded, liberated, invaded again. Through it all, Silith walked her grove, each day a little more hollow, a little less herself. She no longer remembered her name. She no longer remembered why she was bound to this place. She only knew that she must protect it, must keep it exactly as it was. When travelers stumbled into the grove by accident, drawn by its eerie beauty, she would watch them from behind the trees with eyes that held no recognition, no humanity. Some she would allow to leave, their minds clouded with confusion, unable to remember the path they had taken. Others, those who tried to take cuttings from the trees or water from the pool, those who threatened to disturb the frozen perfection, she would drive away with magic that had grown wild and strange over the long years. Nature spells twisted into something feral and cruel. The local people began to tell stories. They spoke of a ghost in the forest, a creature neither living nor dead that guarded a cursed grove where time stood still. They said that those who entered the grove and returned were never quite the same, that they would wake screaming from dreams of endless repetition, of being trapped in a single moment forever. Parents warned their children to stay away from the deep forest, to never follow strange lights or beautiful music that might lead them to the weeping grove. And still, Silith walked her paths, less like a guardian now and more like a prisoner, bound by chains she had forged herself. The grove sustained her body, but consumed her spirit, piece by piece, memory by memory. She had wanted to preserve what she loved, to stop the natural cycle of death and rebirth. Instead, she had created a prison for them both. Guardian and grove locked together in an embrace that would last until the world itself ended. The Druids of the Moonshi Isles speak of her now as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when love becomes obsession, when the desire to protect transforms into the need to control. They say that on certain nights, when the moon is full and the wind carries the scent of moonflowers, you can hear weeping in the deep forest. Not the sound of sorrow, but something worse, the sound of someone who has forgotten how to grieve, who has lost even the memory of what was lost. Silith Greenbow wanted to save her grove from death. Instead, she condemned them both to something far worse, an existence without change, without growth, without end. A perfect, beautiful hell that would last forever. Lore number 2, the Tiefling's Curse. In the great city of Baldur's Gate, where merchants haggle over silks and spices in the wide, where adventurers seek fortune in the shadows of the outer city, there are those who walk among the crowds bearing marks they did not earn and carrying sins they did not commit. Their skin holds hues that nature never intended, crimson and violet, deep blue and ashen gray. Horns curve from their brows in patterns as unique as fingerprints. Tails lash behind them in moments of anger or fear. They are the Tieflings, the planet-touched, those who carry infernal blood in their veins through no choice of their own. But every Tiefling bloodline begins somewhere, with someone who made a choice. Tonight, we speak of Malachar Thornheart and the terrible bargain he struck that would curse his descendants for generations uncounted. The year was 1358 Dale Reckoning, a time of great upheaval in the region that would one day become the Western Heartlands. War swept across the land like wildfire, petty lords, and would-be kings, carving territories from blood-soaked earth. Malachar Thornheart was one such lord, a minor noble with vast ambitions and insufficient means to achieve them. He held a small keep on the border of what was then contested territory, commanding perhaps 200 soldiers and controlling 3 farming villages that could barely feed themselves, let alone support an army. Malachar was a proud man, intelligent and charismatic, beloved by his people for his fair judgments and generous spirit. But pride can be a double-edged sword, and Malachar's pride would not allow him to accept his modest station. He watched as greater lords expanded their holdings, as men with less merit and more ruthlessness carved out kingdoms, while he struggled to maintain his single keep. It gnawed at him, the unfairness of it all, the knowledge that he possessed greater vision and capability than those who ruled over vast domains. When his lands came under threat from a neighboring warlord, a brutal tyrant who commanded an army of mercenaries numbering in the thousands, Malachar knew he could not prevail through conventional means. His soldiers were brave but few. His walls were strong but not impregnable. He sent messages begging for aid from the greater lords, but none came. In their eyes, he was too small to matter, too insignificant to save. Desperation drives men to seek solutions in dark places, and Malachar Thornheart was desperate indeed. He began to study forbidden texts, scrolls and grimoires that had been hidden in the deepest vaults of his keep's library, left there by some previous owner who had dabbled in arts better left forgotten. He read of pacts and bargains, of entities that dwelled in the 9 hells, who could grant power to mortals willing to pay the price. The texts spoke of Mephistopheles, the lord of Cania, the 8th layer of the 9 hells, the archdevil of hellfire and arcane might, whose cunning was matched only by his cruelty. Mephistopheles offered power to those who sought it, but his contracts were legendary for their cruel precision, every word crafted to extract maximum suffering, while technically fulfilling the bargain's terms. Malachar convinced himself that he was clever enough to outwit a devil, that his need was pure enough to justify the means. He was not seeking power for himself, he reasoned, but to save his people from slaughter and subjugation. Surely there was a way to make a bargain that would give him what he needed without damning his immortal soul. On a moonless night, in a chamber deep beneath his keep, where the stone walls were carved with protective wards that had long since lost their potency, Malachar performed the summoning ritual. He drew the circle in his own blood, spoke the words of binding in Infernal, a language that burned his throat to pronounce. He offered what he thought was an acceptable price, his service for 7 years after his natural death, his soul to be bound to the 9 hells as a minor functionary, a clerk or scribe in Mephistopheles' vast bureaucracy. The archdevil did not appear himself, of course. Beings of such power rarely troubled themselves with individual mortals. Instead, he sent an emissary, a pit fiend named Balzephin, who manifested in a column of fire that filled the chamber with sulphurous heat. The devil listened to Malachar's plea with an expression of amused contempt, his burning eyes taking in every detail of the desperate mortal before him. Balzephin agreed to the bargain with surprising ease, which should have been Malachar's first warning. The devil offered terms that seemed almost generous. Mephistopheles would grant Malachar the power to defend his lands, to turn back his enemies, and claim victory. In exchange, Malachar would serve in the hells for 7 years after death, as proposed. The contract was drawn up in letters of flame on parchment that reeked of brimstone. Malachar read it 3 times, searching for hidden clauses, and found none that he recognized as threatening. He signed his name, and the pact was sealed. The power came immediately, flowing into Malachar like molten metal poured into a mold. He felt his body changing, strengthening, felt arcane knowledge flooding his mind. He learned to speak words that summoned hellfire, to command lesser devils, to instill fear with a glance. When the warlord's army arrived at his walls, they found not the easy conquest they expected, but a defense that seemed impossible. Malachar stood upon his battlements and called down flames from a cloudless sky. He summoned imps and lesser devils who sowed chaos in the enemy ranks. His own soldiers fought with supernatural courage, inspired by wards and enchantments their lord had never possessed before. The siege lasted 3 days before the warlord withdrew, his forces shattered, his ambitions broken. Malachar had won, and his people celebrated him as a hero and savior. He told himself that the price had been worth it, that 7 years of service after death was a small cost for saving hundreds of lives. But the changes in Malachar did not stop with the battle's end. His eyes began to glow with a faint red light in moments of anger. His shadow moved independently of his body, twisting into shapes that suggested wings and horns. His temperament grew harsher, his judgments more severe. The man who had been beloved for his compassion found himself ruling through fear, punishing small infractions with disproportionate cruelty. He married, hoping that love might anchor him to his humanity. His wife, Celeste, was a gentle woman who saw the good man Malachar had been and believed she could call him back from the darkness. She bore him 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. And for a time, Malachar felt hope that he might yet salvage his soul. Then the children began to change. The eldest, a boy named Aldrich, was the first to manifest the signs. At age 5, small nubs appeared on his forehead, growing into curved horns over the course of a year. His skin darkened from healthy pink to a deep crimson. His eyes shifted from his mother's soft brown to burning amber. The second son, Marcus, followed the same pattern. The daughter, Ilara, developed horns that spiraled like a ram's and skin the color of wine. Celeste wept when she saw what her children were becoming, but she never stopped loving them. The people of the keep, however, began to whisper. They saw the marks of the infernal on their lord's children and understood that Malachar's victory had come at a price far greater than he had admitted. Fear and suspicion spread through the villages like plague. Malachar returned to his hidden chamber and searched desperately through the contract he had signed. And there, he found the clause he had missed. The terms were written in the tiniest script, almost invisible unless one knew to look for it. The power Mephistopheles had granted was not merely arcane ability, but the Archdevil's own infernal essence, woven into Malachar's bloodline. The transformation would pass to his descendants, generation after generation, forever marking his lineage as touched by the 9 hells. His children would suffer for his choice, and their children, and their children's children, unto the end of time. Malachar tried everything to break the curse. He consulted priests and paladins, offering to do any penance, make any restitution. But the servants of the gods told him what he already knew in his heart. A pact with an archdevil could not be broken by mortal magic or divine intervention. Only Mephistopheles himself could release the bloodline, and the archdevil had no reason to show such mercy. The Lord, who had sought to protect his people, became the source of their fear and hatred. His children grew up shunned and isolated, called devil spawn and hellborn by those who had once celebrated their father as a hero. Celeste did what she could to shield them, to teach them that they were not defined by their appearance. But the world was cruel to those who bore infernal marks. When Aldrich came of age, he left the keep and traveled far to the east, hoping to find a place where his heritage was unknown. He married and had children of his own, and every one of them bore the marks of their cursed bloodline: horns and tails, skin in shades of red and purple, eyes that glowed with inner fire. The Tiefling blood ran true, generation after generation, never diluting, never fading. Malachar Thornheart died at the age of 63, his body failing as the infernal power that had sustained him finally consumed him from within. In his final moments, he understood the full scope of Mephistopheles' cruelty. The 7 years of service after death were nothing, a trivial addition to the contract. The true punishment was watching his bloodline marked and cursed forever, knowing that every descendant would suffer for his pride and desperation. His soul descended to Cania, the frozen 8th hell, where he serves still in Mephistopheles' citadel of ice and hellfire. The Archdevil keeps him as a clerk, recording the names and sins of new arrivals, and Mephistopheles makes certain that Malachar sees every Tiefling who dies bearing his bloodline. The Archdevil shows him their lives, every moment of suffering caused by the marks they carry, every rejection, every moment of fear and hatred directed at them for the crime of being born. It is a torment exquisitely designed, as only a devil of Mephistopheles' skill could craft. Malachar suffers not for his own damnation, but for the endless damnation of the innocent, for children born century after century who never asked to carry infernal blood, who committed no sin save being born to the wrong lineage. The Thornheart line spread across Faerun over the centuries, the name itself lost to time as descendants took new names, trying to escape the stigma. But the blood remembers, in cities from Baldur's Gate to Waterdeep, from Neverwinter to Calimport. There are Tieflings who carry Malachar's curse in their veins, most never knowing the origin of their heritage. They face prejudice and fear, are turned away from temples and taverns, suspected of evil simply for existing. Some embrace the darkness that the world expects of them, turning to warlocks and dark pacts as their ancestor did, perpetuating the cycle. Others fight against their nature, becoming paladins and clerics, proving through actions that bloodline does not determine destiny. But all of them carry the weight of a choice made more than 6 centuries ago by a man who thought he was saving his people. The priests of the Hells say that Mephistopheles laughs when he walks past Malachar's desk in the frozen citadel, that the Archdevil takes particular pleasure in the elegance of this damnation, one soul purchased for a pittance, and the suffering multiplied across thousands of descendants, each one a testament to the price of pride. This is the true curse of the Tiefling bloodlines that trace back to the 9 hells. Not the horns or the skin or the strange powers that manifest in some, but the knowledge that they are paying for sins they did not commit, marked by choices made by ancestors they never knew. They are the living proof that sometimes the cruelest punishments are not those we bring upon ourselves, but those we inflict unknowingly upon generations yet unborn. Lore number 3. The Kenku's lost voice. There are punishments that end with death, and then there are punishments that transform death into mercy denied. The Kenku know this truth better than any race in all the planes of existence. They are the living monuments to a crime so ancient that even they have forgotten the details. Cursed to walk the earth without the gifts that once defined them. Forever bound to silence save for the voices they steal from others. In the time before time was carefully measured, when the boundaries between the material plane and the elemental plane of air were thinner than cobweb silk, there existed a race of avian beings who served a master whose name has been lost to the ages. Some scholars claim this master was a powerful Archfey of the Wind Courts. Others insist it was a primordial of air, a being of such vast power that gods themselves kept wary distance. Still others whisper that the master was something stranger, something that existed between the categories mortals, used to organize the cosmos. What is known, what the Kenku themselves remember in the fragmented way of creatures who can no longer speak their own history, is that they were once magnificent. They soared through skies both mortal and elemental, with wings of gleaming black feathers that caught the light like polished obsidian. Their voices were legendary, capable of songs so beautiful that storms would pause to listen. Winds would gentle themselves to carry the melodies further. They were messengers, scouts, and spies for their master, traveling between worlds with ease, bearing secrets and treasures across the plains. But the Kenku possessed something beyond their physical gifts. They had creativity, true creativity, the spark of innovation that allows a being to imagine what does not yet exist and bring it into reality. They were master craftsmen, creating tools and art of such quality that even the dwarves acknowledged their skill. They were inventors, designing mechanisms and solutions to problems their master faced. They were artists, painting and sculpting, and composing works that captured the essence of flight itself. Their master valued them for these talents, but also feared them. A servant who can create is a servant who can imagine freedom. A messenger who travels freely between planes is a messenger who might one day choose not to return. The master's control over the Kenku was absolute, but it was also fragile, maintained through loyalty and the Kenku's genuine affection for the being they served. Then came the theft. The master possessed an artifact of immense power, though the nature of this artifact varies depending on which ancient text one consults. Some describe it as a perfect gemstone that contained the first word ever spoken, the sound from which all language descended. Others speak of a staff carved from the world tree itself, capable of commanding any creature that drew breath. Still others mention a crown woven from solidified wind, granting dominion over all things that flew. Whatever the artifact's nature, it represented the core of the master's power, and the master kept it hidden in a vault that only the most trusted Kenku could access. These elite servants maintained the vault, cleaned the chamber, ensured that no harm came to the precious object within. They were chosen for their absolute loyalty, their unquestioning devotion. But devotion can be corrupted, and loyalty can be bought. A group of Kenku, never fewer than 7, and never more than 13 depending on the telling, began to question their servitude. They had traveled widely, had seen how other races lived without masters to command their every action. They had witnessed freedom, and once witnessed, freedom becomes a hunger that gnaws at the soul. These Kenku began to meet in secret, to whisper plans in shadowed corners where even the wind could not hear. They decided to steal the artifact, to take their master's source of power, and use it to free themselves and their entire race. They convinced themselves that this was not betrayal but liberation, that their master had no right to bind them simply by virtue of creating them. They planned meticulously, using their positions of trust to map out every security measure, every ward and trap that protected the vault. The theft itself was executed with perfection. They bypassed wards that would have stopped gods' disabled traps that had guarded the artifact for millennia. They took the artifact and fled, scattering across the plains to make pursuit difficult. For a brief moment, they believed they had won, that they had secured freedom for their people. They had underestimated their master's reach, and more importantly, they had underestimated their master's wrath. The master's rage was not hot, but cold, not quick, but deliberate. When the theft was discovered, the master did not pursue the thieves immediately. Instead, the master called together every Kenku across all the plains, summoning them with a compulsion they could not resist. They came in flocks that darkened skies, thousands upon thousands of Kenku, answering a call they did not understand. The master appeared before them, and those who witnessed it said the air itself seemed to scream in anguish. The master pronounced judgment not just on the thieves, but on the entire Kenku race. The crime of a few would become the curse of all, a collective punishment that would serve as an eternal warning to any other servants who might contemplate similar treachery. The curse was threefold, each element crafted to remove what had made the Kenku special, to transform them from soaring messengers into grounded shadows. First, the master stripped away their wings. Not physically, for the feathers and bone remained, but the ability to use them for flight was torn away. The Kenku retained their avian forms as a cruel reminder of what they had lost, hollow mockeries of the magnificent creatures they had been. They would walk the earth like the terrestrial races they had once pitied, forever looking up at skies they could no longer reach. Second, the master took their voices. The Kenku could no longer speak in sounds of their own making, could no longer sing or cry or laugh with their own voice. Instead, they were cursed to speak only through mimicry, forced to parrot the words and sounds of others. Every conversation became a patchwork of stolen phrases. Every attempt at communication, a reminder that they possessed no voice that was truly theirs. Third, and perhaps most cruelly, the master stripped away their creativity. The spark of innovation that had allowed them to craft and invent and imagine was extinguished, leaving them capable only of copying what already existed. They could forge documents by perfectly replicating another's handwriting, but they could not write in a style of their own. They could duplicate artwork, but they could not create original pieces. They became perfect mimics in all things, mirrors that could reflect, but never generate light of their own. The curse descended upon the Kenku like a thunderbolt, striking every member of the race simultaneously, no matter where in the multiverse they stood. Kenku, who had been soaring through the elemental plane of air, fell from the sky, wings suddenly useless. Kenku, who had been singing in the courts of the Fae, found their voices stolen mid-note. Kenku, who had been crafting in their workshops, found their hands capable only of copying existing designs. The despair was immediate and absolute. Some Kenku went mad, unable to cope with the sudden loss of everything that had defined their existence. Others fell into a grief so profound that they simply ceased to move, standing like statues until their bodies failed. Those who survived the initial shock found themselves transformed into something lesser, something broken. The thieves who had stolen the artifact tried to use it to reverse the curse, but they found that the master's magic was woven too deeply to be undone by even the most powerful artifact. Some versions of the story claim the thieves were never found, that they still hide somewhere in the multiverse, desperately seeking a way to undo what their actions caused. Other versions insist the master caught them and administered punishments so terrible that the details have been deliberately forgotten. The Kenku were cast out from their master's service, exiled to the material plane to live among the terrestrial races. They found themselves unwelcome almost everywhere they went. Their appearance marked them as other, as creatures who did not belong. Their inability to speak normally made communication difficult and frightening to those unfamiliar with their curse. Their talent for mimicry and forgery made them natural suspects for any crime involving deception or theft. Over the centuries, the Kenku adapted to their curse as best they could. They learned to survive on society's margins, using their mimicry and forgery skills to earn coin where they could. Some became criminals, turning their curse into tools for theft and con artistry. Others found honest work where their talents were valued, serving as copyists and documentarians. A few even became adventurers, using their skills to aid parties who could look past their curse to see their value. But adaptation is not the same as acceptance. Every Kenku carries the weight of the curse, the knowledge that they were once something greater and were reduced to shadows of that glory by the crimes of a few. They do not remember the details of what was stolen or who their master was, but they remember the loss. It echoes in every word they speak in borrowed voices. In every moment, their feet touch the ground when their hearts cry out for sky. The Kenku pass down what history they can through perfectly memorized stories told in the voices of long-dead elders. Young Kenku learn their people's tragedy through these fragmented tales, delivered in a patchwork of voices that often shift mid-sentence as the speaker draws on different memories. The effect is haunting, a chorus of the dead speaking through the living, ensuring that the curse is never forgotten, even if the specific details have been lost to time. Some Kenku seek redemption for their race, hoping that if they can discover what was stolen and return it, the curse might be lifted. They become obsessed scholars and treasure hunters, chasing legends and rumors across Faerun and beyond. Most die without success, but they die hoping. And for a cursed race, hope is sometimes the closest thing to freedom they can achieve. Others embrace their curse, turning their limitations into strengths. They become the finest forgers in the land, their perfect mimicry making their work indistinguishable from authentic documents. They become master thieves, their silence and skill allowing them to move through shadows like ghosts. They prove that even broken creatures can survive, can even thrive, if they are clever and determined enough. The Kenku are a warning written in flesh and feather, a reminder that betrayal carries consequences that can echo across generations. They are proof that some punishments never end, that some crimes stain not just the guilty, but everyone who shares their blood. They walk the world as living monuments to a theft committed so long ago that even the gods have forgotten the details. Forever denied the sky, forever speaking in stolen words, forever creating nothing new. And in the quietest moments, when a Kenku stands alone and looks up at the stars, you can see in their eyes a grief so old and so deep that it has worn grooves into their very souls. They remember, in the way that bones remember, what it meant to fly. They remember singing in voices that were theirs alone. They remember creating beauty that the world had never seen before. They remember being whole, and that memory is the cruelest curse of all. Lore number 4, the vampire's first night. There are moments in history when a single choice transforms not just one life, but the nature of existence itself. When a desperate act births something that should never have been, something that spreads like disease through the centuries, creating children of darkness who never asked to be born. The vampire is such a creation, and though many claim the title of first, there was one whose transformation predates even the legends, whose hunger was the template from which all others would follow. Her name was Velisara Nightalow, and she was the most celebrated priestess of Lathander, the morning bringer that the city of Myth Draenor had ever known. This was in the time before the city's fall, when Myth Draenor stood as the crown jewel of elven civilization, a place where magic and art flourished in equal measure. The year was 637 Dale reckoning, and the world was younger then, the boundaries between life and death more firmly drawn. Undeath existed, certainly. Liches walked the earth, skeletons served dark wizards, ghosts haunted the places where they died. But the vampire, the creature that fed on the living while wearing the face of the beloved dead, that particular horror had not yet been born. Velisara was moon elf of exceptional beauty and even more exceptional faith. She had dedicated herself to Lathander in her youth, drawn to his teachings of renewal and hope, of each dawn bringing new possibilities. She served in his grandest temple in Myth Draenor, a structure of white marble and gold that caught the first rays of sunrise and seemed to glow from within. Her healing touch was legendary. The sick and injured came from across Faerun seeking her blessing, and she turned none away. She was beloved not just by her congregation, but by the entire city. Nobles sought her counsel on matters of state. Artists asked her blessing on their works. Children ran to greet her in the streets, knowing she always carried sweet candies in her robes. She embodied everything that Lathander represented: light and life, and the promise that tomorrow would be better than today. Velisara had a twin brother, Malachar, who walked a very different path. Where she had chosen service to the light, he had pursued arcane knowledge with single-minded obsession. He studied at the Academy of High Magic, delving into theories and practices that made even his instructors uneasy. He was brilliant, perhaps the most naturally gifted wizard of his generation. But his brilliance was coupled with arrogance and a fundamental inability to accept limitations. The twins were close despite their different paths, bound by blood and genuine affection. Velisara worried about her brother's increasingly dark studies, but she believed that her light could balance his darkness, that her faith could guide him back from whatever edge he approached. Then Malachar made a mistake that no amount of brilliance could undo. He was attempting to create a new spell, something that would allow him to peer into the far realm, the alien dimension beyond the boundaries of normal reality. The math was perfect, the components precisely measured, the incantation flawlessly pronounced. But the far realm does not obey the laws of magic as mortals understand them. The spell succeeded in opening a window into that impossible space. But what looked back through that window was something that should never have had eyes to see. The entity that noticed Malachar was vast and hungry and utterly incomprehensible. It reached through the window he had opened, not physically, but conceptually, and touched his mind in ways that shattered his sanity like glass under a hammer. Malachar screamed, and the scream did not stop even when his throat tore and blood filled his mouth. The entity pulled, trying to drag him through the window into the far realm, to add him to whatever collection of broken things it kept in that lightless void. His fellow students managed to close the portal, severing the entity's grip, but the damage was done. Malachar's mind was gone, burned away by contact with something mortal consciousness was never meant to comprehend. His body survived, technically. His heart beat, his lungs drew breath. But there was nothing behind his eyes except endless horror, an eternal scream trapped in a shell that no longer housed a soul. They brought him to Velisara, hoping that her legendary healing touch might reach him where conventional magic had failed. She tried everything she knew, every prayer and ritual in Lathander's extensive canon. She called on her god directly, begging for intervention, offering anything in exchange for her brother's restoration. She sat by his bedside for weeks, holding his hand, speaking to him of their childhood, of happy memories, desperately trying to call him back from wherever he had gone. Lathander did not answer, and Malachar remained lost. The other priests counseled Velisara to accept what had happened, to let her brother's body die, so his soul could move on to whatever afterlife awaited it. But Velisara would not accept that her brother was beyond saving. Her faith in Lathander's power to renew and restore was absolute. If the Morningbringer would not intervene, then perhaps she simply had not yet found the right prayer, the right ritual, the right sacrifice. Her search led her down paths that a priestess of Lathander should never have walked. She began to study the same forbidden texts her brother had consulted, reasoning that understanding what had harmed him might reveal how to heal him. She sought out practitioners of necromancy, death priests who understood the boundary between life and what lay beyond. They told her that her brother's soul was still tethered to his body, trapped there by the trauma of what had happened, unable to move on, but unable to return. One necromancer, an ancient human whose name has been lost to history, offered her a solution. There existed rituals, he said, that could call a soul back to a body even after death, that could bind life force so strongly that it could not be taken by even the most powerful entities. These rituals were forbidden, violations of the natural order, but they worked. He could teach her for a price. Velisara paid the price. She traded secrets of Lathander's temple, locations of holy artifacts, information that the necromancer used to desecrate and destroy. She told herself that once Malachar was restored, they would make amends, would recover what she had betrayed. The ends justified the means. They had to. The ritual the necromancer taught her required components that made Velisara's stomach turn. The heart of a child, still warm, the tears of a widow, grave dirt from 7 different tombs, and blood, so much blood, from sources the necromancer specified with casual cruelty. Velisara gathered these components with shaking hands, each acquisition another step away from the light she had served her entire life. On the night of the new moon, when darkness was absolute and Lathander's influence at its weakest, Velisara performed the ritual in the basement of her brother's tower. She drew the circles, spoke the words in a language that hurt her throat, mixed the components in a silver bowl that had once held holy water. She cut her own wrists and let her blood flow over her brother's still form, binding her life to his, calling his soul back from the edge of the far realm with the strength of her love and the power of forbidden magic. The ritual worked after a fashion. Malachar's eyes opened. Awareness returned to his face. But what came back was not her brother, not entirely. The thing that had touched him in the far realm had left a stain, a fundamental corruption that the ritual had not cleansed, but instead amplified. Malachar sat up, looked at his sister, and smiled with a mouth full of teeth that had become too sharp, too many. He was hungry, he said, so very hungry, and Velisara smelled delicious. She tried to run, but he was faster than any elf should be. He caught her in 3 strides and bore her to the ground. She felt his teeth tear into her throat, felt her blood flowing out in hot pulses. She tried to scream to call for help, but her voice came out as a wet gurgle. As her vision darkened, as her life pumped out onto the cold stone floor, her last thought was a prayer to Lathander, begging forgiveness for what she had done. She died there, on the floor of her brother's tower, murdered by the person she had loved most in all the world. But death was not the end. Velisara woke 3 nights later in darkness absolute. She was lying in her own bed in her chambers at the temple, and she could not understand how she had gotten there. The last thing she remembered was Malachar's teeth in her throat, the taste of her own blood. She sat up, confused and disoriented, and immediately knew that something was terribly wrong. Her body felt different, lighter and stronger simultaneously. Her senses were impossibly sharp. She could hear conversations happening in chambers 3 floors below. She could smell individual people throughout the temple, could identify them by scent alone. And underneath, all of this was a hunger unlike anything she had ever experienced. A gnawing emptiness that demanded to be filled. She stood and walked to the mirror, and what she saw there made her gasp. Her reflection was there, which would not be the case in later vampire bloodlines, but it was changed. Her skin had lost all color, becoming pale as fresh snow. Her eyes had darkened from their natural amber to deep crimson. When she opened her mouth, she saw fangs where her canines had been, sharp and white, and clearly designed for tearing flesh. The hunger surged stronger, and with it came knowledge, terrible knowledge that seemed to flow directly into her mind. She knew what she had become. She understood that her death and the death of her brother had triggered something in the ritual, had twisted the magic into something new and horrible. She was no longer alive, but she was not simply undead, in the way a skeleton or ghost was undead. She was something in between, a corpse animated by stolen life, sustained by blood consumed from the living. She tried to pray, to call on Lathander for guidance, but the words turned to ash in her mouth. The moment she spoke his name, pain lanced through her entire body, burning from the inside as if her blood had become acid. She fell to her knees, whimpering, and understood that she was cut off from her God, severed from the divine connection that had defined her entire existence. The hunger grew stronger, impossible to ignore. It consumed her thoughts, pushed aside everything else, until all that remained was the need to feed, to sink her teeth into warm flesh and drink deep. She fought it, tried to resist, but she was so new to this existence that she had no defense against the urge. She left her chambers and walked through the temple in a daze. It was near midnight, and most of the other priests were asleep. The few who were awake and saw her assumed she was simply making evening rounds, as she sometimes did when sleep eluded her. They smiled and nodded. These people who trusted her, who loved her, who had no idea what she had become. Velisara found herself in the novice's quarters, standing over the bed of a young elf girl who had recently joined the temple. The girl was perhaps 40 years old, barely an adult by elven standards, and she slept with the peaceful expression of someone whose faith was pure and untested. Velisara looked down at her and felt the hunger roar, felt her fangs extend, felt predatory instinct override everything that made her who she was. She told herself she would take only a little, just enough to quiet the hunger. She would be gentle, would not hurt the girl. The bite would heal, and the girl would never need to know what had happened. These were lies, but Velisara desperately needed to believe them. She bent over the sleeping novice and bit down, her fangs sliding through skin and muscle with ease she found horrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The girl woke with a gasp, tried to scream, but Velisara's hand covered her mouth, silencing her. The blood flowed into Velisara's mouth, hot and sweet, and more satisfying than anything she had ever tasted. The hunger receded, replaced by pleasure so intense it was nearly painful. She drank and drank, unable to stop, even as the girl's struggles weakened, even as the heartbeat beneath her lips grew slower and fainter. Some part of her mind screamed at her to stop, that she was killing an innocent, that this was the ultimate betrayal of everything she had stood for. But that part was distant, drowned out by the ecstasy of feeding. When she finally pulled away, the girl was dead, her face frozen in an expression of terror and confusion. Velisara looked at what she had done and felt nothing, which was somehow worse than feeling horror. The hunger was sated for now, and in its absence, there was only emptiness, a void where her conscience and faith had been. She fled the temple that night, unable to face what she had become, unable to remain in a place sacred to a god who now rejected her. She ran through the streets of Myth Draenor, this city she had loved, and everywhere she looked she saw not people but prey, not friends but meals. The transformation was complete. Velisara, the priestess, was dead. What remained was something new, something hungry, something that would feed again and again until it was destroyed or the world ended. In the nights that followed, as she hid in the sewers beneath the city and emerged only to hunt, Velisara discovered the other changes her transformation had wrought. Sunlight burned her, forcing her to flee indoors or suffer agony that felt like being skinned alive. Running water weakened her, made her limbs heavy and slow. She could not enter a home unless invited, some cruel joke written into her nature that forced her to rely on deception and manipulation. But she had gained powers as well. She was stronger than she had ever been, fast enough to blur when she moved at full speed. She could command rats and wolves, call them to serve her with a thought. She could take the form of mist or bat, shape-shifting with ease that would have taken druids decades to master. And most dangerous of all, those she killed by draining their blood sometimes rose 3 nights later as she had, hungry and damned and bound to serve her will. Velisara tried to end her own existence several times in those early weeks, but her body refused to cooperate with her mind's desire for death. She could be hurt, could even be destroyed if the damage was severe enough. But simple suicide was beyond her. She was cursed to continue to feed, to spread her affliction to others through the cruel mechanism of her hunger. Her brother Malachar remained in his tower, and when she returned there, she found that he too had undergone the full transformation. Whatever he had been immediately after the ritual, he was now the same thing she was, a creature sustained by stolen blood, damned to eternal hunger. They did not speak of what had happened, of the rituals and choices that had led to this. There was nothing to say. They simply were what they were, and the world would have to adapt to their existence. The priests of Lathander discovered the dead novice and launched an investigation that quickly revealed other victims, bodies drained of blood and left in alleys and abandoned buildings. They did not immediately suspect Velisara, for she had vanished completely. But eventually, the truth came out. A witness saw her feeding, recognized her despite her transformation, and brought word to the temple. The hunt was organized quickly. Paladins and clerics, warriors of light armed with holy symbols and blessed weapons, swept through the city searching for the fallen priestess and her brother. They found Malachar first, cornered him in his tower, and learned through hard experience what it took to destroy one of these new creatures. Holy water burned them, sacred weapons could harm them, but they were terribly hard to kill. Malachar slaughtered half the hunting party before a paladin managed to drive a stake of blessed ash through his heart, pinning him in place long enough for them to sever his head and burn both pieces separately. Velisara evaded capture by fleeing Myth Draenor entirely, escaping into the wilderness beyond the city's borders. She wandered for years, feeding on travelers and isolated farmers, learning to hide what she was, perfecting the art of pretending to be alive. She created others like herself, sometimes intentionally and sometimes by accident. And those she created went on to create more. The curse spread like plague through the shadows of Faerun, creating bloodlines that would persist for millennia. In time, others discovered different ways to become what Velisara was. Dark rituals, pacts with demons, curses laid by vengeful gods. All of these created vampires with slightly different characteristics, different strengths and weaknesses. But Velisara's bloodline was the first, the template from which all others derived, and her descendants would claim proudly that they were purest expression of the vampire curse. Velisara herself wandered for centuries, growing stronger and more skilled with each passing year. The guilt that had plagued her in the early years faded, replaced by cold pragmatism and predatory cunning. She learned to view mortals not as people, but as resources, necessary for her survival and nothing more. She built hidden sanctuaries in cities across Faerun, establishing networks of mortal servants who provided her with victims and protection from sunlight. She became one of the most feared vampire lords in history, a creature of such power that even other undead gave her respectful distance. But there were still moments, in the deepest hours of night, when even her hunger was briefly sated, when Velisara remembered who she had been. She would think of the temple, of the light streaming through stained glass windows, of children's laughter, and the warmth of serving something greater than herself. These memories brought no comfort, only the hollow ache of loss so profound that it had no bottom. She had wanted to save her brother, to heal him through the power of love and forbidden magic. Instead, she had condemned them both to damnation, and spread that damnation across the world like a disease for which there would never be a cure. Every vampire that walked the night was her descendant in some fashion. Every victim drained of blood could be traced back to that first terrible feeding in the temple of Lathander. The priests say that Velisara still exists somewhere in the world, ancient beyond measure, powerful beyond mortal comprehension, and utterly empty of everything that once made her worthy of Lathander's love. They say she is a warning written in immortal flesh, a reminder that the road to damnation is paved not with malice, but with love twisted into obsession, with faith corrupted by desperation. And on certain nights, in certain cities, when someone vanishes without a trace and is found 3 days later drained of blood and cold as winter stone, the old ones whisper that Velisara has passed through, that the first vampire still hungers after all these centuries, still feeds, still spreads her curse to new victims who never asked to become monsters. The vampire's first night was Velisara's last night as anything resembling human, the moment when hunger consumed everything else and transformed a priestess of light into an eternal creature of darkness. And that night has never truly ended, for it echoes still in every vampire that rises, in every victim that falls, in every dawn that the damned cannot witness without agony. The Yuan-Ti's transformation. There are sacrifices made in the name of survival, and then there are sacrifices made in the name of transcendence. The difference between the two lies not in what is given up, but in what is gained, and whether the price was worth the transformation. In the steaming jungles of ancient Chult, in a time before the great empires rose and fell, there existed a human civilization that chose to shed its humanity like a snake sheds its skin, deliberately and without regret, seeking to become something greater than mortal flesh could ever be. They succeeded after a fashion, but what they became was not greater. It was simply other and far more terrible. The story begins in the empire of Estharda's son, whose name translates roughly to those who walk in serpent's shadow. This was not the empire's original name. Once, they had been called something else, something human and pronounceable. But that name was deliberately forgotten, erased from every stone tablet and papyrus scroll, struck from the memories of those who underwent the transformation. To become Yuan-Ti was to reject the past entirely, to declare that what came before was weakness that deserved no remembrance. The empire arose along the banks of a great river that cut through the jungle like a silver scar, providing fertile ground for agriculture and easy transportation for trade. The people who built this civilization were not remarkable in any particular way. They were humans, clever and ambitious, as humans tend to be. But they possessed no great magic, no divine favor, no particular advantage over the dozens of other human tribes and kingdoms scattered across the continent. What they did possess was fear. Their empire sat in the heart of territory claimed by more powerful neighbors. To the north, a kingdom of savage warriors who valued strength above all else and took slaves from weaker peoples. To the south, a theocracy of sun worshippers whose priests commanded divine magic that could level cities. To the east and west, jungles filled with monsters, dinosaurs, and worse, that viewed humans as convenient prey. The people of Esthartes Sun lived every day knowing that their civilization could be destroyed at any moment by forces they could not hope to match. Their emperor, a man named Thassalar the Wise, was plagued by this knowledge. He had inherited an empire that was prosperous but vulnerable, wealthy but weak. He lay awake at night imagining invasion, conquest, his people slaughtered or enslaved, his line ended, his name forgotten. Fear gnawed at him like a living thing, consuming his thoughts, driving him to seek solutions that others would never consider. Thassalar was a scholar as well as a ruler, learned in histories both ancient and obscure. He studied accounts of civilizations that had risen to greatness through various means, seeking patterns, searching for the secret that would allow his people to not just survive, but thrive. He read of powerful magic, of pacts with gods and demons, of ritual sacrifices and forbidden knowledge. Most of these paths were closed to him, requiring resources or connections his empire did not possess. Then he discovered references to the Sarok, the ancient reptilian creator race that had dominated the world in epochs past. These beings had possessed knowledge of transformation magic, the ability to alter flesh and bone, to rewrite the very essence of what a creature was. The Sarok were long gone, extinct or departed to other planes, but they had left behind ruins scattered throughout the jungles, temples, and laboratories where their greatest works had been conducted. Thassalar became obsessed with finding these ruins, convinced that the secrets contained within could provide the power his empire needed. He sent expeditions into the deepest jungle, gave them maps copied from fragmentary texts, ordered them to search until they found what he sought or died trying. Many died. The jungle was not forgiving of intrusion, and the ruins of the Sarok were protected by guardians, both magical and mundane, traps that still functioned after thousands of years. But eventually, one expedition succeeded. They returned bearing stone tablets covered in script that predated human writing, along with stranger things, crystallized magic in forms that hurt to look at directly, preserved organs from creatures that had never existed in nature, and most importantly, detailed instructions for rituals of transformation. The rituals were complex beyond anything human magic had yet achieved, requiring components that were difficult or impossible to obtain. Precise timing aligned with celestial events, and most critically, willing participants who understood that the transformation was irreversible. The Sarok had used these rituals to create servitor races, beings designed for specific purposes, shaped by magic to perfectly fulfill their intended roles. Thassalar studied the tablets for years, consulting with the Empire's wisest priests and most skilled mages. Together, they began to understand the principles underlying the transformation magic. Though they could not fully replicate the Sarok's mastery, they experimented cautiously at first, using condemned criminals as test subjects, attempting simpler transformations before progressing to more complex work. The results were horrifying. Failed transformations produced creatures that were neither human nor anything else, twisted abominations that died screaming or had to be destroyed out of mercy. Success was almost worse, creating beings that were changed as intended, but traumatized by the process, their minds broken by the sudden shift in their fundamental nature. But Thassalar persevered, driven by his fear and his conviction that this was the only path to his empire's salvation. He refined the rituals, adjusted the components, learned from each failure, and gradually, over the course of a decade, he developed a working transformation ritual that could reliably produce the results he desired. The ritual would transform humans into serpent-human hybrids, beings that retained human intelligence and cunning while gaining the physical advantages of snakes, enhanced strength, venomous fangs, scales that turned blades, the ability to sense heat and move silently through any terrain. They would become apex predators, creatures designed for survival in a hostile world. But there was more to the transformation than physical change. The ritual also altered the subject's mind and soul, stripping away what Thassalar called the weaknesses of humanity: compassion, empathy, love, all the emotions that bound humans together in families and communities, but also made them vulnerable to manipulation and suffering. The transformed would be cold and logical, capable of any action necessary for survival or advancement without the burden of conscience. Thassalar presented his work to the Empire's ruling council, and the debate that followed nearly tore the nation apart. Some saw the transformation as an abomination, a violation of everything that made them human. Others argued that survival trumped all other considerations, that maintaining their humanity was pointless if they were conquered and destroyed. The Empire split into factions, and for a time, it seemed civil war might erupt. Then the invasion came, not from one of the anticipated threats, but from a previously unknown force, a horde of savage humanoids from deep within the jungle. Thousands strong and utterly ruthless, they swept across the Empire's border settlements, killing everyone they found, burning everything they could not carry away. The Empire's military was caught unprepared, and within weeks, it was clear that conventional forces could not stop the invasion. Thassalar saw his opportunity and seized it. He offered a choice to his people: transformation or death. Accept the ritual and become Yuan-Ti, creatures capable of surviving and fighting back, or cling to their humanity and watch their civilization burn. Faced with extinction, most chose transformation, though many did so with tears streaming down their faces, knowing they were sacrificing something precious that could never be reclaimed. The first transformations were conducted on volunteers from the military, soldiers who understood that they were becoming weapons, tools to save their people. They entered the ritual chambers as humans, men and women with families and hopes and fears. They emerged as something else entirely. Their bodies reshaped into serpentine forms that varied based on the specific ritual variant used. Some became what would later be called Yuan-Ti purebloods, retaining mostly human appearance, but with scales in place of skin, serpentine eyes, and forked tongues. Others transformed into half-bloods, their lower bodies becoming serpent tails, while their upper bodies remained humanoid. The most extreme transformations produced abominations, creatures that were more snake than human, with multiple serpent heads emerging from humanoid torsos, bodies covered in writhing scales, minds alien and cold. But all of them, regardless of form, felt the change in their souls. The ritual stripped away their capacity for love, for mercy, for all the gentle emotions that had defined their humanity. They looked at their former families with cold, analytical eyes, seeing resources or tools rather than beloved kin. They felt no horror at what they had become, because horror required the capacity for moral judgment, and that had been burned away in the transformation. The Yuan-Ti military was unleashed against the invading horde, and the tide of war turned with terrifying swiftness. The Yuan-Ti fought with precision and ruthlessness that shocked even their enemies. They used venom and ambush, struck from darkness, and melted away before retaliation could be organized. They took no prisoners, showed no mercy, pursued fleeing enemies until every last one was dead. Within 6 months, the invasion was repelled, the horde scattered and destroyed. Thassalar declared the transformation a success and ordered it expanded to the entire population. Facilities were constructed throughout the Empire ritual chambers where humans could enter and Yuan-Ti would emerge. The process became almost mechanical. Thousands transformed every week, an entire civilization systematically shedding its humanity. Not everyone went willingly. Some fled into the jungle, preferring to risk death in the wilderness rather than submit to transformation. Others resisted openly, forming rebellions that were crushed with the same cold efficiency the Yuan-Ti had shown their external enemies. The transformed did not hesitate to kill those who had once been neighbors and friends, viewing resistance as simply a problem to be solved through the most efficient means available. Within 5 years, the transformation was complete. An entire human civilization had become Yuan-Ti, and the empire was renamed Tharda's Sun in honor of their new nature. They rebuilt their cities to accommodate their changed forms, with wider streets for those with serpent tails, heated chambers for cold-blooded metabolisms, and temples dedicated to serpentine deities rather than the human gods who no longer answered their prayers. The Yuan-Ti Empire became a power to be feared throughout the region. Their military was unmatched. Their magic grew more potent as they mastered the Saruk's ancient techniques, and their complete lack of mercy made them terrifying enemies. They expanded their territory, conquering neighboring kingdoms, enslaving populations to serve their needs. They felt no guilt about any of this, because guilt was a human emotion, and they were human no longer. But the transformation had costs that Thassalar had not anticipated. Yuan-Ti were incapable of the bonds that held human societies together, the love and loyalty that made people willing to sacrifice for each other. Without these bonds, Yuan-Ti society became purely transactional. Every interaction calculated for advantage, every relationship temporary and conditional. They could not trust each other because trust required empathy they no longer possessed. The empire began to fracture from within. Yuan-Ti plotted against each other constantly, each seeking to advance their position through betrayal and manipulation. Assassination became so common that rulers rarely survived more than a few years before being replaced by whoever successfully killed them. The society that had transformed itself to ensure survival was tearing itself apart through internal conflict. Thassalar himself was one of the first casualties. He had transformed into a Yuan-Ti abomination of great power, but that power made him a target. His own children, transformed and emotionless, saw him as an obstacle to their advancement and conspired to have him killed. He died in his bed, poisoned by venom from serpents his daughter controlled, his last thoughts not of betrayal or sorrow, but simply calculating how he might have prevented this outcome. The Yuan-Ti Empire never collapsed entirely, but it fragmented into smaller kingdoms and city-states, each ruled by the strongest and most cunning Yuan-Ti, who could maintain power through constant vigilance. They continued their practice of enslaving other races, viewing non-Yuan-Ti as inherently inferior, useful only as labor or food or subjects for magical experimentation. Over the centuries, the Yuan-Ti spread beyond their original territory, establishing hidden enclaves in jungles and swamps throughout the world. They never forgot the transformation rituals, and sometimes they would capture humans and force them through the process, creating new Yuan-Ti to serve as slaves or soldiers. These involuntary transformations were even more traumatic than the original voluntary ones, leaving victims trapped in serpentine bodies they never chose, stripped of emotions they desperately wanted to keep. The descendants of those original transformed humans still exist, scattered across Faerun in hidden temples and forgotten cities. They plot and scheme, worship dark serpent gods, conduct bloody sacrifices, and dream of the day when Yuan-Ti will rule over all lesser races. They remember nothing of having once been human, for that memory was deliberately erased. But sometimes, in moments of stillness, they feel an echo of something lost, a phantom sensation of emotions they no longer possess and can never reclaim. The Yuan-Ti are a warning about the price of survival purchased through self-destruction. Thassalar wanted to save his people, and in a sense, he succeeded. The Yuan-Ti survived where humans might have perished, became powerful where humans had been weak, but in doing so, they destroyed everything that made survival meaningful. They became living creatures without lives, thinking beings without souls, survivors who had killed what they were trying to save. In the deepest Yuan-Ti temples, there are murals depicting the first transformation, showing humans entering ritual chambers with expressions of fear and determination. These murals are not viewed with pride or celebration because Yuan-Ti are incapable of such emotions. They are simply records, documentation of a process that worked, a solution to a problem. The Yuan-Ti look at images of their human ancestors and feel nothing. Because feeling requires a humanity they deliberately shed like a snake sheds its skin. And unlike a snake's skin, which will grow back in time, humanity once lost can never be reclaimed. The Yuan-Ti discovered this too late, and they live still with the consequences of a choice made in fear. A transformation that saved their lives while destroying everything that made those lives worth living. Lore number 6, the Archfey's broken promise. The Feywild is a realm of beauty and terror in equal measure. A mirror to the material plane where everything is heightened, more vibrant, more alive, and infinitely more dangerous. Time moves strangely there, emotions run deeper, and words have weight that can bind souls for eternity. The beings who rule that realm, the Archfey, are creatures of pure whimsy and ancient power, and they love nothing more than making bargains with mortals who wander into their domain. But the Fey do not think as mortals do not value what mortals value, and their promises, while never technically broken, often fulfill themselves in ways that destroy everyone involved. There was once a woman named Alara Brightwood who learned this truth too late, who made a deal with an Archfey seeking salvation, and found only damnation wrapped in flowers and moonlight. Alara lived in a small village on the edge of the misty forest, in a time when the boundaries between the material plane and the Feywild were thinner than they are now. This was approximately 800 years ago, long before the great cities of the Sword Coast rose to prominence, when humans were still carving out territories from wilderness that had belonged to elves and Fey for countless millennia. The village was poor but peaceful, surviving on farming and hunting, bothering no one and hoping to be bothered by no one in return. Alara was the village healer, a woman of perhaps 30 summers who had learned herbcraft from her grandmother. She knew which plants could cure fever, which could ease pain, which could staunch bleeding. She was not a cleric with access to divine magic, not a wizard with arcane power, simply a skilled practitioner of mundane medicine. But in a village too small to attract more powerful healers, her skills were invaluable, and she was beloved by everyone who lived there. She had a daughter, Kasha, who was 7 years old and the light of Alara's life. The girl's father had died in a hunting accident when Kasha was just a baby, and Alara had raised her alone, pouring all her love and hope into this one precious child. Kasha was bright and curious, always asking questions, always wanting to help her mother gather herbs and mix medicines. Alara dreamed of teaching her daughter everything she knew, of passing down the healing knowledge that had sustained their family for generations. Then Kasha fell ill with a sickness that Alara could not cure. It started with a cough, nothing alarming at first. But the cough grew worse, became racking spasms that shook the girl's small frame. Fever followed, burning so hot that Kasha's skin felt like heated metal to the touch. Alara tried every remedy she knew, every tea and poultice and tincture. Nothing helped. The fever would not break, the cough would not ease. Within a week, Kasha could barely breathe, her small chest struggling with each inhalation. Alara begged for help from everyone she could reach. A traveling priest came and tried to pray over Kasha, but his connection to his deity was weak. His healing prayers barely more effective than Alara's herbs. A hedge wizard passing through the village attempted a healing charm, but the magic fizzled and failed. They all told Alara the same thing. The sickness was too advanced, too deeply rooted. Kasha was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do. Alara refused to accept this. She sat by her daughter's bedside night after night, listening to each labored breath, watching the life slowly drain from the child she loved more than anything in the world. She prayed to every god whose name she knew, begged for mercy, for intervention, for a miracle. But the gods, if they heard her at all, did not answer. Desperation makes people do foolish things, makes them seek solutions in places they would normally know to avoid. Alara remembered stories her grandmother had told her, tales of the Fae who dwelled in the deepest parts of the misty forest, beings of great power who sometimes granted wishes to mortals brave or foolish enough to seek them out. The stories always ended badly, with the mortal getting what they asked for in ways they never intended. But Alara's mind latched onto the possibility and would not let go. If the gods would not save her daughter, perhaps the Fae would. She left Kasha in the care of a neighbor and ventured into the misty forest at twilight, carrying offerings she had gathered based on fragments of old stories. cream and honey, flowers picked at midnight, a lock of her own hair. She walked deeper into the woods than anyone from the village had gone in living memory, following paths that seemed to appear before her feet and vanish behind her, moving through a landscape that felt increasingly unreal. The forest changed as she walked. The trees grew taller, their bark taking on colors that nature never intended, silver and gold and deep violet. The air smelled of flowers she could not name, sweet and intoxicating. Lights danced between the branches, not fireflies, but something stranger, small glowing spheres that giggled with voices like chiming bells. She had crossed into the Feywild without even realizing it, drawn across the boundary by her desperation and the offerings she carried. She emerged into a clearing where the moon hung impossibly large and close, bathing everything in silver light. In the center of the clearing sat a throne woven from living vines and flowering branches. And upon that throne sat the most beautiful being Alara had ever seen. The Archfey called herself Ilindra of the Twilight Court, though she had many other names, some too long and complex for mortal tongues to pronounce. She appeared as a woman of impossible grace, with skin that seemed to shift between the pale white of birch bark and the deep green of forest shadows. Her hair flowed like water, changing color from silver to gold to copper with each movement. Her eyes were violet and held depths that suggested both vast kindness and incomprehensible cruelty. Ilindra smiled at Alara's approach, a smile that was warm and welcoming, and somehow terrifying in its perfection. She asked what brought a mortal to her clearing, and Alara, barely able to speak through her tears, explained about Kasha, about the illness, about her desperate need for help. The Archfey listened with an expression of sympathy that seemed genuine, though with Fey it was always impossible to tell what was real emotion and what was performance. When Alara finished, Ilindra spoke in a voice like music, saying that she could indeed save the child. Such things were well within her power. But Fey do not give gifts freely, and a life saved required appropriate payment. Alara asked what price the Archfey would demand, prepared to offer anything she possessed. Ilindra's smile widened, showing teeth that were just slightly too sharp. The price, she said, was service. Alara would serve Ilindra for 7 years, dwelling in the Feywild, performing whatever tasks the Archfey required. At the end of 7 years, Alara would be free to return to the mortal world, and her daughter would live a long and healthy life. 7 years seemed an eternity to Alara, but 7 years was better than losing Kasha forever. She agreed, and Ilindra produced a contract written in flowing script on parchment that seemed made of pressed flower petals. The terms were exactly as stated. Ilindra would cure Kasha's illness, and Alara would serve for 7 years, after which she would be released, and her daughter would enjoy good health. Alara signed the contract with a quill that drew blood instead of ink, and and the moment her name was complete, she felt magic settle over her like a cloak. Ilindra clapped her hands in delight and declared the bargain sealed. She sent Alara back to the mortal world with a wave of her hand, and Alara found herself standing outside her cottage as if no time had passed at all. She rushed inside and found Kasha sitting up in bed, the fever gone, the cough vanished. The child looked better than she had in weeks, her cheeks pink with health, her eyes bright with restored vitality. Alara wept with relief and held her daughter close, thanking every god and spirit she could think of. But the relief lasted only moments. As Alara held Kasha, she felt the contract's magic activate, felt invisible chains wrap around her soul. She was pulled away from her daughter, yanked across the boundary between worlds, and found herself back in Ilindra's clearing in the Feywild. The Archfey smiled and welcomed her, saying that her service had now begun. Alara begged to be allowed to say goodbye to Kasha properly, to explain where she was going. Ilindra reminded her gently that the contract said nothing about farewells or explanations. It only specified 7 years of service, beginning when the child was cured. The child was cured, therefore the service began immediately. Alara had got exactly what she bargained for, nothing more and nothing less. The 7 years Alara spent in Ilindra's service were both wonderful and horrific in ways that defied mortal comprehension. The Feywild was beautiful beyond description, filled with wonders that no mortal realm could match. Ilindra treated her well by Fey standards, never cruel, often kind, providing her with fine clothes and comfortable quarters and tasks that were not particularly difficult. Alara tended Ilindra's gardens, organized her collections of mortal curiosities, served wine at revels where beings of impossible beauty danced to music that made reality shimmer. But time in the Feywild moves strangely, and emotions there are heightened to painful intensity. A day could last a week or pass in moments. Joy was so intense it became agony, sorrow so deep it felt like drowning. And always, Alara thought of Kasha, wondering how her daughter fared, whether she was frightened by her mother's sudden disappearance, whether she believed Alara had abandoned her. Ilindra would sometimes speak of the mortal world, mentioning in passing that time there moved differently than in the Feywild. Sometimes faster, sometimes slower. It was difficult to predict. Alara tried not to think about what this meant, tried to focus on completing her service so she could return. The 7 years finally ended, measured by the Feywild's strange calendar, marked by seasonal changes in a realm where seasons were more concept than reality. Ilindra declared the contract fulfilled and thanked Alara for her service with what seemed like genuine warmth. She opened a portal back to the material plane and sent Alara through with her blessing. Alara emerged from the misty forest and ran toward her village, her heart full of desperate hope. She would see Kasha again, would hold her daughter, would explain everything and beg forgiveness for the years of absence. 7 years was a long time, but Kasia would be 14 now, old enough to understand that her mother had made a terrible sacrifice out of love. But when Alara reached her village, she found ruins. The cottages were collapsed, the fields overgrown with forest. The well was choked with debris. No smoke rose from any chimney, no voices called out in greeting. The village was abandoned, had been abandoned for what looked like decades. Vines covered walls, trees grew through collapsed roofs, and everywhere was silence. Alara ran through the ruins calling Kasia's name, searching desperately for any sign of life. She found none. The village was empty, everyone gone, and time had clearly passed, far more than 7 years. She collapsed in what had been the village square and wept, understanding too late the full extent of Ilindra's deception. She eventually made her way to the nearest occupied village, several days' walk away, and there she learned the truth. 70 years had passed in the mortal world during her 7 years of service in the Feywild. The village had been abandoned 40 years ago when the last of its inhabitants died or moved away. No one remembered the village's name, much less the names of people who had lived there. Alara asked about Kasia, described her daughter, begged for any information. An old woman finally remembered hearing a story from her grandmother about a girl from that abandoned village, a child whose mother had vanished into the forest and never returned. The girl had lived to adulthood, had married, and had children of her own. She had died of old age 30 years ago, survived by grandchildren who had scattered to other towns and cities. Kasia had lived a long and healthy life, exactly as the contract promised. She had simply lived it and died while Alara served in the Feywild, believing her mother had abandoned her, never knowing the sacrifice that had been made. Alara tried to find Kasia's descendants, hoping to at least meet the grandchildren of her daughter. But 70 years had passed, and trails grow cold with time. She found a few distant relatives who vaguely acknowledged the family connection, but had no real interest in a strange woman claiming to be their impossibly old ancestor. To them, she was simply a confused stranger, probably touched in the head, making up stories about impossible bargains with Fae. She returned to the misty forest and found the boundary to the Feywild screaming Ilindra's name, demanding the Archfey appear and answer for what she had done. Ilindra came, stepping through the boundary with the same beautiful smile, asking what had upset Alara so terribly. Alara accused the Archfey of breaking the bargain, of stealing 70 years instead of 7, of causing her to miss her daughter's entire life. Ilindra listened with an expression of mild confusion, then gently explained that she had broken nothing. The contract specified 7 years of service, and Alara had served exactly 7 years by the Feywild's reckoning. The contract said Kasia would live a long and healthy life, and she had. Every term had been fulfilled precisely as written. The contract had said nothing about time passing equally in both realms. It had said nothing about Alara being able to see her daughter again, only that she would be released after 7 years. It had promised Kasha would live long and healthy, not that Alara would be present for that life. The Archfey had kept every promise she made, fulfilling the letter of the contract with perfect fidelity, while violating its spirit so completely that the result was crueler than any outright betrayal could have been. Ilindra offered sympathy for Alara's pain, but reminded her that mortals should be more careful when bargaining with Fey. Words matter, specificity matters, and assumptions are dangerous when dealing with beings who exist outside mortal time and mortal values. Then she vanished, returning to the Feywild, leaving Alara alone in a world that had moved on without her. Alara lived for 20 more years in the mortal world, a stranger in a time that was no longer her own. Everyone she had known was dead. The world had changed in ways she could not fully comprehend, and she carried the weight of knowing that her daughter had lived and died, believing herself abandoned. She tried to build a new life, but the grief was too profound. She eventually walked into the misty forest one final time and was never seen again. The locals say she crossed back into the Feywild voluntarily, preferring the timeless beauty of that realm to the mortal world that held nothing but pain. Others claim she simply died in the forest, her body claimed by the wild. A few insist they sometimes see her ghost wandering the boundary between worlds, forever searching for a daughter she will never find. Ilindra of the Twilight Court still holds court in her clearing, still makes bargains with desperate mortals who seek her aid. She always fulfills her contracts exactly as written, never breaking a single term, and those who deal with her always come to understand too late that the Fae define promises very differently than mortals do. The Archfey collects these broken souls like others collect flowers, beautiful tragedies to admire during long, immortal years. The story of Alara Brightwood serves as a warning to any who would bargain with the Fae. The Archfey do not lie, but neither do they share mortal values or mortal understanding. They fulfill contracts with cruel precision, finding ways to honor every word while ensuring maximum suffering. A promise kept can be more devastating than any betrayal, and the Fae excel at granting wishes in ways that make the wisher regret ever asking. In the Feywild, Ilindra sometimes speaks of Alara to her courtiers, calling the story a perfect example of mortal foolishness. The woman got exactly what she asked for. The Archfey says, with a smile, her daughter lived a long and healthy life. That Alara was not present for that life was simply an unfortunate detail she failed to specify in the contract. One must be precise when dealing with the Fae, after all. And in the ruins of that abandoned village, on certain nights, when the moon is full and the boundary between worlds grows thin, travelers sometimes report hearing a woman's voice calling a name over and over, Kasha, she cries, her voice full of love and loss and desperate hope. Kasha, I'm here, I came back, please answer me. But no answer comes, because the person being called has been dead for decades, and some searches can never end because what was lost can never be found. The Archfey's promise was kept, but the promise was poison, and Alara Brightwood paid for her daughter's life with everything that made that life worth saving. Lore number 7. The Death Knight's last memory. There are those who fall from grace slowly, their descent measured in small compromises and justified betrayals. And then there are those who plummet all at once. A single catastrophic choice that transforms hero into monster in the span of a heartbeat. The Death Knight is born from such moments, when honor and duty collide with desperation and pride, when a warrior sworn to protect becomes the very thing they once hunted. These cursed beings walk the world as mockeries of what they were, eternal reminders that the distance between righteousness and damnation can be crossed in a single step. Sir Aldrich Stormshield was everything a paladin should be, a living embodiment of the virtues espoused by Torm the True, god of duty and loyalty. He stood 6 feet and 4 inches tall, broad-shouldered and strong, his face marked by a scar across his left cheek that he had earned defending a village from bandits. His armor gleamed silver in sunlight, blessed by the high priests of Torm themselves, and his sword had been passed down through 7 generations of paladins in his family, each one adding their own blessings to the blade. Aldrich had served Torm faithfully for 23 years, since the day he took his oath at age 18. He had fought undead in the crypts beneath water-deep, battled demons that emerged from planar rifts in the north, protected the innocent from threats, both mundane and supernatural. His reputation was spotless, his faith unshakable. Children pointed at him in the streets and whispered that he was a true hero. Parents held him up as an example of what their sons should aspire to become. He commanded a company of 30 paladins and clerics, warriors of light who rode throughout the western heartlands, righting wrongs and smiting evil wherever it appeared. They called themselves the Silver Dawn, and their banner was recognized and welcomed in every good-aligned settlement from Baldur's Gate to Neverwinter. Aldrich led them with wisdom and compassion, never asking his followers to take risks he would not take himself, always first into battle and last to retreat. Among his company was his younger brother, Matthias, who had followed Aldrich into service to Torm. Matthias was everything Aldrich was not. Where Aldrich was serious and measured, Matthias was cheerful and impulsive. Where Aldrich followed rules and doctrine, Matthias trusted his instincts and improvised. But the brothers loved each other deeply, and Matthias worshipped his older brother, saw him as the perfect example of what a paladin should be. The Silver Dawn was called to investigate reports of necromantic activity in a region known as the Blackwood, a forest with a dark reputation where even druids feared to tread. Villagers spoke of the dead rising from their graves, of shadowy figures conducting rituals in abandoned clearings, of screams echoing through the trees at midnight. Aldrich gathered his company and rode out immediately, determined to cleanse whatever evil had taken root in that cursed place. They found the necromancer's lair in the heart of the Blackwood, a ruined temple that had once been dedicated to a forgotten god of death. The structure was crawling with undead, skeletons and zombies and worse things, creatures that had been human once, but were now twisted into shapes that defied nature. The silver dawn attacked at dawn, holy symbols raised high, prayers to Torm on their lips. The battle was fierce and terrible. The undead came in waves that seemed endless, rising from the very earth to attack the paladins. Aldrich's company fought with courage and skill, but the necromancer had prepared well, had set traps and ambushes that took a heavy toll. Paladins fell, their armor rent by skeletal claws, their flesh torn by zombie teeth. Aldrich felt each loss like a knife to his heart, but he pressed forward, knowing that retreating would only allow the necromancer to raise more dead, to threaten more innocents. They reached the temple's inner sanctum where the necromancer waited, a gaunt figure in robes of tattered black, his eyes glowing with sickly green light. He was powerful, far more powerful than the reports had suggested, wielding magic that made the air itself feel cold and dead. Aldrich charged him, his blessed sword raised high, and the two clashed in combat that shook the temple's foundations. The fight seemed to last hours, though it could only have been minutes. Aldrich poured everything he had into the battle, calling on Torm's power, channeling divine energy through his blade. The necromancer countered with spells of death and decay, with curses that sought to rot Aldrich's flesh from his bones. Around them, the remaining members of the Silver Dawn battled the necromancer's undead guardians, trying to reach their commander, trying to turn the tide of battle. Aldrich saw his opening when the necromancer overextended, launching a spell that left him vulnerable for just a moment. The paladin lunged forward and drove his blessed blade through the necromancer's chest, the holy metal burning through corrupt flesh. The necromancer screamed, a sound of pure agony and rage. And as he died, he spoke a curse in a language that predated human civilization. The curse struck Aldrich like a physical blow, invisible but overwhelming. He felt it wrap around his soul, felt dark magic trying to corrupt the divine light that burned within him. He called on Torm, begged his god for strength to resist, and felt an answering surge of power that drove the curse back. For a moment, he thought he had won, that his faith was strong enough to overcome even a necromancer's dying curse. Then he heard Matthias scream. Aldrich turned and saw his brother surrounded by undead, saw skeletal hands dragging Matthias down, saw zombie teeth tearing into his armor. Aldrich ran toward him, but he was too far away, had left his position to strike down the necromancer, and now his brother was paying the price for that choice. He watched in horror as Matthias disappeared beneath a mass of writhing undead, heard his brother's screams cut off abruptly, saw blood spreading across the temple floor. Something broke in Aldrich in that moment. Not his faith, not his honor, but something deeper, something fundamental to who he was. The disciplined paladin who always followed doctrine, who trusted in Torm's plan, who accepted that some battles resulted in losses. That warrior ceased to exist. What remained was a brother who had failed to protect the person he loved most in all the world. Aldrich felt the necromancer's curse still clinging to him, felt it waiting for a moment of weakness to complete its work. And in his grief and rage, he made a choice that would doom him. He reached for the curse instead of pushing it away, grabbed hold of the dark magic, and pulled it into himself, accepting its power, welcoming it. If divine magic had not been enough to save Matthias, then perhaps darker powers would serve where light had failed. The transformation was immediate and agonizing. The curse flooded through Aldrich's body, corrupting everything it touched. His blessed armor turned black as midnight, the holy symbols carved into it twisting into mockeries of their original forms. His sword, blessed by 7 generations of paladins, became a weapon of darkness, its holy light replaced by flames that burned with cold rather than heat. His flesh grew pale and cold. His eyes turned from warm brown to icy blue that glowed with unnatural light. And his connection to Torm, the divine bond that had defined his entire adult life, was severed completely. He felt it break like a rope pulled too tight, felt the warmth of his god's presence vanish, leaving only emptiness and cold. The pain of that loss was worse than any physical wound he had ever suffered. But with the curse came power, terrible power. Aldrich rose from where he had fallen and unleashed magic he had never known, spells of death and destruction that made the necromancer's abilities seem like children's tricks. He slaughtered the undead that had killed Matthias, tore them apart with dark energy, destroyed them so thoroughly that they could never rise again. He killed every remaining undead in the temple, working through them like a force of nature, unstoppable and merciless. When the slaughter ended, the temple was silent except for the sounds of Aldrich's own breathing, harsh and ragged in the stillness. His surviving paladins stood at the temple's entrance, staring at him with expressions of horror and fear. They recognized what he had become, recognized the signs of a fall so complete that there could be no redemption. Aldrich walked to where Matthias lay and fell to his knees beside his brother's broken body. He wanted to weep, to mourn, but he found that the curse had taken even that from him. The emotions were still there, the grief and guilt and self-hatred, but they were distant, now muted, as if he was feeling them through thick glass. He reached out to touch Matthias's face, and his hand, which had once healed with divine touch, now brought only cold. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see the surviving members of the Silver Dawn approaching cautiously. their weapons drawn. They were afraid of him. He could see it in their faces. These warriors who had fought by his side for years, now looking at him as if he were a monster. Their leader, a paladin named Elise, who had been Aldrich's second in command, spoke in a voice that shook with barely controlled emotion. She said that Aldrich had fallen, that he had embraced the very evil they had sworn to fight, that he was now anathema to everything the Silver Dawn represented. She gave him one chance to submit to judgment, to allow them to try to break the curse, or, if that proved impossible, to grant him a merciful death. Aldrich looked at her, and at the other paladins, at people who had trusted him, followed him, believed in him. He knew what he should do. He should accept judgment, should allow them to try to save him or end him. That was what the old Aldrich, the paladin who followed doctrine and trusted in Torm's plan, would have done. But the old Aldrich was gone, burned away by the necromancer's curse, and his own choice to embrace it. What remained was something else, something that could not submit, could not accept judgment from those who had not saved Matthias, who had not prevented this catastrophe. He stood and drew his corrupted sword, and the blade burst into flames of black and purple, cold fire that sucked heat from the air. He told Elise and the others to leave, to go and never return, or he would kill them all. They did not believe him at first, thought he was bluffing, that some remnant of the man he had been would prevent him from harming former comrades. They were wrong. When they moved to surround him, Aldrich attacked with speed and power that his old self had never possessed. He killed 3 paladins in the first exchange, his dark blade cutting through blessed armor as if it were parchment. He called forth magic that animated the corpses of fallen Silver Dawn members, turning his own dead followers into undead servants. The surviving paladins fled, and Aldrich let them go, watching them disappear into the forest with eyes that felt nothing but cold satisfaction. He had won, had proven that his power was superior, had demonstrated that the curse he had embraced made him stronger than divine magic ever had. But the victory felt hollow, meaningless. He looked down at Matthias's body again and felt the distance between what he had become and what he had been. The old Aldrich would have been devastated by killing former comrades, would have fallen to his knees and begged forgiveness. This new Aldrich simply noted it as a necessary action and moved on. He tried to use his dark powers to raise Matthias, to bring his brother back as he had raised the other dead. But something prevented it, some quality in Matthias's soul that rejected the necromantic magic. His brother was truly gone, beyond the reach of even the curse's terrible power. Aldrich left the temple and wandered into the Blackwood, and over the following weeks, he completed his transformation into what would come to be known as a Death Knight. His body became more corpse-like, his flesh taking on the appearance of preserved death. His armor fused to his body, becoming part of him, no longer removable. He discovered that he could no longer feel warmth, could no longer taste food or drink, could no longer sleep or dream. He existed in a state between life and death, sustained by the curse and his own will, unable to move on, but unable to truly live. The last clear memory Aldrich possessed of his time as a true paladin, the last moment before everything changed, was the instant before Matthias fell. He remembered seeing his brother fighting, remembered feeling proud of Matthias's courage, remembered thinking that they would win this battle together and return home as heroes. That memory was preserved in perfect clarity, frozen in time, a monument to everything he had lost. He clung to that memory because it was all he had left of who he had been. Everything after was tainted by the curse, by the choices he had made, by the darkness he had embraced. But that one moment remained pure, untouched, a fragment of light in an existence consumed by shadow. Aldrich Stormshield wandered the world for decades, serving no master, but unable to rest, driven by guilt he could feel, but no longer properly process. He haunted battlefields and graveyards, raised armies of undead not for conquest, but simply because animating the dead was the only thing that felt familiar, the only echo of the purpose he had once possessed. Occasionally, he would encounter those who had known him, who remembered Sir Aldrich the Paladin, and he would see the horror and pity in their eyes before he drove them away or killed them. The order of paladins who had once celebrated him now hunted him, sending warriors to destroy the monster he had become. Aldrich killed them all, not with pleasure, but with cold efficiency, adding their bodies to his growing collection of undead servants. Each death was another mark against the man he had been, another weight added to guilt that had long since become too heavy to bear, but which the curse prevented him from escaping through remorse or redemption. In the cold halls of his corrupted keep, surrounded by the undead remains of those he had killed, Aldrich Stormshield would sometimes stand in silence and recall that last memory. Matthias fighting with courage and determination, the pride Aldrich had felt, the certainty that they would prevail together. That moment before everything fell apart, before the curse, before the fall, before he became the thing he now was. The Death Knight's last memory of honor was also the moment when honor died, when the paladin who embodied every virtue chose vengeance over faith and embraced damnation to grasp at power he could not wield wisely, and that memory would remain forever, perfect and untarnished, a reminder of what had been lost and could never be reclaimed, a monument to the terrible truth that sometimes the greatest evil comes not from malice, but from love twisted beyond recognition by grief and rage. Lore number 8, the Dragonborn's Exile. Among the Dragonborn, there is no greater honor than clan, and no greater shame than exile. To be cast out from one's clan is to lose not just family and home, but identity itself. Dragonborn define themselves by their lineage, their draconic ancestry, the color of their scales that marks them as descendants of chromatic or metallic dragons. To be exiled is to become nameless, clanless, a ghost walking among the living. And yet, sometimes exile comes not from dishonor, but from honor taken too far, from loyalty that refuses to bend even when bending would be wise. This is the story of Kriv of Clan Nemesis, whose devotion to his people led him to commit the one act his clan could never forgive, whose greatest virtue became his most terrible crime. Clan Nemesis was one of the oldest Dragonborn clans in the Empire of Tiefling, tracing their lineage back to the first Dragonborn who emerged from draconic servitude to claim their freedom. They were proud warriors, their scales the color of burnished bronze, marking them as descendants of bronze dragons. The clan held significant influence in the empire, commanding respect from other clans, holding seats on the ruling council, maintaining estates that covered hundreds of acres of fertile land. Kriv was born into this legacy of honor and power. He was the third son of the clan's patriarch, Balasar, a warrior of legendary skill who had led Clan Nemesis to victory in countless battles. From his earliest days, Kriv was trained in the ways of war, taught to wield sword and spear, to breathe lightning as his bronze dragon ancestors had breathed it, to embody the values of strength, courage, and absolute loyalty to clan above all else. He excelled in his training, showing natural aptitude that even his more experienced brothers could not match. By the time he reached his 20th year, Kriv stood 6 feet and 8 inches tall, his bronze scales gleaming like polished metal, his physical strength such that he could bend iron bars with his bare hands. He won tournament after tournament, earning glory for his clan, and his father looked upon him with pride that bordered on astonishment. But Kriv possessed something beyond physical prowess. He had a sense of justice that ran deeper than clan loyalty, a moral compass that pointed toward what was right rather than what was expedient. His father recognized this quality and worried about it, for the history of the Dragonborn was filled with examples of those whose rigid principles had led them to destruction. The trouble began when Clan Nemesis entered into a trade dispute with Clan Verthasathergish, a clan of red-scaled Dragonborn who controlled valuable mining operations in the mountains to the north. The dispute was over water rights, a stream that flowed from the mountains through Nemesis lands. Clan Verthasathergish claimed ancient rights to divert the stream for their mining operations. Clan Nemesis insisted the water belonged to whoever's land it crossed. The dispute escalated from words to violence. Verthasathergish warriors attacked Nemesis farmers, burning fields and destroying irrigation channels. Nemesis retaliated by ambushing Verthasathergish caravans, stealing the ore they were transporting to market. Blood was spilled on both sides, and the conflict threatened to explode into full-scale war between two of Tiefling's most powerful clans. Kriv's father Balasar, called a council of the clan's warriors and announced his intention to launch a decisive strike against Clan Verthasathergish. They would attack the mining operations directly, collapse the tunnels, make the entire dispute meaningless by destroying what the red-scaled clan was fighting to protect. It would be a devastating blow, one that would establish Clan Nemenis's dominance and force Verthasathergish to accept whatever terms were offered. Kriv stood in that council and heard his father's plan, and he knew immediately that it was wrong. The mining operations employed hundreds of workers, many of them not warriors, but simple laborers, families who had done nothing to deserve being buried alive when the tunnels collapsed. The attack his father proposed would kill innocents by the dozens, possibly hundreds, all to settle a dispute over water that could be resolved through negotiation or compromise. He spoke against the plan, arguing that such an attack would violate the very honor the clan claimed to uphold. Dragonborn warriors fought warriors, he said, not civilians. There were other ways to resolve the dispute, ways that did not require mass slaughter of the innocent. His words were met with stony silence from the assembled warriors, and his father's expression darkened with anger. Balasar told his son that he was young and naive, that he did not understand the realities of clan politics. Mercy was weakness in the eyes of other clans, and weakness invited predation. If Clan Nemenis showed reluctance to do what was necessary, other clans would sense vulnerability and press their own disputes more aggressively. The attack would proceed, and Kriv would lead the vanguard as befitted his skill and status as the patriarch's son. Kriv refused. He would not participate in the murder of innocents, would not lead warriors to commit atrocities in his clan's name. His refusal was met with shock and outrage. A warrior refusing a direct order from the patriarch was almost unheard of. A son refusing his own father was unthinkable. Balasar gave Kriv one more chance to obey, warned him that continued refusal would be considered betrayal of the clan. Kriv stood firm, and his father's expression shifted from anger to something colder, more terrible. Betrayal, Balasar said, and the word hung in the air like a death sentence. That night, Kriv did what his conscience demanded, but what his clan could never forgive. He left the Nemenis estate under cover of darkness and traveled to the territory of Clan Verthasathergish. He sought audience with their patriarch, a warrior named Gesh, and revealed his father's plan. He described the attack in detail, the timing, the forces that would be deployed, everything needed for Verthasathergish to prepare a defense or evacuate the civilian workers. Gesh listened with an expression that cycled between suspicion and grudging respect. He asked Kriv why he would betray his own clan, and Kriv answered that he was not betraying his clan, but trying to save it from committing an act that would stain its honor permanently. Better to lose a tactical advantage than to become the kind of clan that murdered innocents to win disputes. Gesh accepted the warning and immediately began evacuating the mining operations, moving workers and their families to safe locations, preparing defenses to meet the expected attack. When Clan Nemesis warriors arrived 3 days later to launch their assault, they found the mines empty and Verthasatherjish warriors waiting in ambush. The attack failed completely, with Nemesis suffering heavy casualties while inflicting minimal damage on their enemies. Balasar knew immediately that someone had betrayed the plan, and investigation quickly revealed that Kriv had been seen traveling toward Verthasatherjish territory on the night before the evacuation began. The Patriarch's rage was biblical in its intensity. He had lost warriors, had suffered a humiliating defeat, and the cause was his own son's treachery. Kriv was arrested and brought before a full assembly of Clan Nemesis. Hundreds of warriors and civilians gathered to witness judgment. The evidence of his betrayal was presented, and Kriv did not deny it. He admitted going to Clan Verthasatherjish, admitted warning them of the planned attack, admitted that his actions had led directly to the mission's failure and the deaths of Nemesis warriors. He tried to explain his reasoning, to argue that the original plan was unjust, that he had acted to prevent greater dishonor. But his words fell on deaf ears. The assembled clan members saw only betrayal, only a son who had chosen enemies over family, who had valued abstract principles over the lives of his own clanmates. The sentence was unanimous. Kriv would be exiled, cast out from Clan Nemesis permanently. His name would be struck from all clan records, his achievements erased, his existence denied. Any member of Clan Nemesis who aided him, or even spoke to him after the exile was pronounced, would themselves be cast out. He would become invisible to his people, a ghost, less than dead, because at least the dead were remembered. The ritual of exile was conducted at dawn, with the entire clan assembled to witness. Kriv was stripped of his clan colors, the bronze badges and symbols that identified him as Nemesis. His personal belongings were taken, everything that connected him to his family and history. His father approached him one final time and spoke the words of disownment in a voice that shook with barely controlled fury. Kriv, son of Balasar, was no more, Balasar declared. There was only Kriv the Nameless, the Clanless, the Exile. Kriv was given 1 day's supplies and escorted to the boundary of Nemesis lands. Behind him, he could hear his clan beginning the ritual of forgetting, chanting to expunge his name from their collective memory. Ahead of him lay the wilderness, and beyond that a world where he would be forever marked as one who betrayed his own blood. Exile was supposed to be a punishment worse than death, and for most Dragonborn it was. Without clan, a Dragonborn had no identity, no purpose, no place in society. Other clans would not accept an exile, viewing them as fundamentally untrustworthy. Exile meant wandering alone until death claimed you, unmourned and forgotten. But Kriv found something unexpected in his exile. He found freedom from the rigid structures that had defined his entire life. Freedom to make choices based on what was right rather than what his clan demanded. He became a wandering warrior, offering his sword to those who needed protection, fighting for causes he believed in rather than for clan glory. He helped villages defend against raiders, protected caravans from bandits, hunted monsters that threatened the innocent. He never asked for more payment than he needed to survive, and he never stayed long in any place. Always moving before his presence could cause problems for those he helped. Word of the bronze-scaled exile who fought with honor spread gradually through the regions he traveled. Years passed, and Kriv carved out a strange existence on society's margins. He was not welcome in Dragonborn communities, but other races accepted him readily enough once they learned he could be trusted. He made allies among humans, elves, dwarves, and halflings. He learned that clan was not the only source of meaning, that family could be chosen rather than inherited. But the pain of exile never truly faded. On certain nights, when he was alone under the stars, Kriv would think of his brothers, wonder if they remembered him, if they ever questioned the justice of his punishment. He thought of his father, the warrior he had admired and disappointed in equal measure. He thought of the clan ceremonies he would never attend again, the gatherings and festivals that marked the passage of Dragonborn life. He had done what he believed was right, had prevented the slaughter of innocents, had saved his clan from dishonor even though they could not see it that way. But the cost had been everything he was, everything that had defined him. He was clanless in a culture where clan was identity itself, nameless among a people who valued lineage above all else. Kriv the Exile wandered for 30 years, growing older, but no less skilled, his bronze scales taking on the patina of age. He became a legend of sorts, the Dragonborn without a clan who fought for honor when honor itself had cost him everything. Bards sang songs about him in taverns, though they often got the details wrong, turned his story into simple heroism rather than the complex tragedy it actually was. And in the halls of Clan Nemesis, his name was never spoken, his existence never acknowledged. The place he had once held in his family was filled by younger cousins, and the clan moved forward as if he had never been. His father died without ever seeing him again, went to whatever afterlife awaited Dragonborn, still believing his son had been a traitor. But Kriv carried no regret for his choice. He had prevented murder, had acted according to principles he still believed were correct. If the price of doing right was losing everything, then that price had been worth paying. He was clanless, yes, but he was not without honor. He was nameless to his people, but others knew his name and spoke it with respect. The Dragonborn's exile was meant to be punishment, meant to be suffering that would make him regret his choices. Instead, it became a kind of freedom, painful and lonely, but also liberating. Kriv learned that identity could survive without clan. That honor could exist outside the structures that claimed to define it. In the end, Clan Nemesis lost a warrior of exceptional skill and unshakable principle. They gained nothing from his exile except the satisfaction of punishing betrayal, and they demonstrated to all who witnessed that loyalty to clan was valued more than justice, more than mercy, more than the lives of innocents. Whether this made them stronger or weaker is a question each observer must answer for themselves. And Kriv the Exile walks still in the stories told about him, forever clanless, forever nameless, forever standing as proof that sometimes the greatest honor comes from being willing to lose everything honor is supposed to represent. Lore number 9, the wizard's forbidden spell. Magic is not merely power waiting to be wielded. It is a living force woven through the fabric of reality, and every spell is a manipulation of that fabric, a gentle tug or violent tear, depending on the caster's intention and skill. Most wizards understand this instinctively, develop a respect for the boundaries that should not be crossed, the incantations that should remain unspoken. But there are always those who believe themselves clever enough, powerful enough, exceptional enough to handle what others fear. These wizards discover too late that some spells were forbidden not because they were difficult, but because they worked exactly as intended, and the results were too terrible to allow. Tharival Darkweave was considered the finest mind to emerge from the Academy of High Sorcery in Waterdeep in 3 generations. He enrolled at age 14, already capable of casting spells that took most apprentices years to master. By 18, he had earned his staff and robes, graduating with honors that the Academy had not bestowed in decades. By 25, he held a position as research master, given his own tower and laboratory, trusted with access to the Academy's most restricted archives. His brilliance was undeniable, but so was his arrogance. Tharival believed that magical knowledge should have no restrictions, that any spell could be used responsibly if the caster possessed sufficient skill and moral clarity. He viewed the Academy's restrictions on certain schools of magic, certain forbidden texts and techniques, as the fearful limitations of lesser minds, who could not handle what he could master with ease. He specialized in transmutation and divination, magics that dealt with changing reality and perceiving hidden truths. His published works revolutionized understanding of both fields, introduced techniques that are still taught to apprentice wizards centuries later. But his private research went far beyond what he shared publicly, delving into combinations of magic that the Academy's founders had specifically prohibited. Tharival became obsessed with a theoretical spell he discovered referenced in fragments scattered across multiple forbidden texts. The spell was never complete in any single source, appearing only as partial incantations, cryptic component lists, dire warnings written in the margins by wizards long dead. The fragments suggested a spell that could reshape reality itself, not just alter objects or transport them between planes, but fundamentally rewrite the laws that governed existence. The potential applications were staggering. A spell that could reshape reality could cure any disease, reverse any death, correct any mistake. It could end suffering, eliminate poverty, create a world perfected according to the caster's vision. Tharival convinced himself that assembling and casting such a spell would be the greatest gift a wizard could give to the world. That his moral compass was true enough to wield such power responsibly. He spent 7 years gathering the fragments, traveling to ruins and forgotten libraries, consulting with scholars who specialized in ancient magical languages. He decoded the cryptic instructions, cross-referenced them with his own extensive knowledge of magical theory, filled in the gaps through careful extrapolation. Slowly, piece by piece, the spell came together like a puzzle, assembled from fragments scattered across centuries. The components required were disturbing. The still-beating heart of a creature that had never known fear. The final breath of someone who died believing they would be saved. Tears shed in absolute joy, immediately followed by tears shed in absolute despair from the same person. Ground bone from a saint and a sinner buried in the same grave. And most troubling, the true name of the caster, spoken backwards at the moment of the spell's completion. Tharival rationalized each requirement. The components were symbolic. He told himself, metaphorical representations of the spell's power rather than literally necessary elements. Even if they were necessary, the ends justified the means. One spell, one moment of darkness, could purchase eternal light for all who came after. He gathered the components through methods he never recorded in his journals. Actions he knew would be judged harshly if revealed. He performed the preparations in secret, telling no one at the academy what he was attempting, knowing they would try to stop him if they understood. On the night of the winter solstice, when the barriers between what is and what could be grow thinnest, Tharival prepared to cast the spell that would change everything. His laboratory was located in the highest tower of his residence, a circular chamber with windows facing all directions, filled with the tools and materials of his craft. He drew the necessary circles on the floor, using powdered silver mixed with his own blood. He positioned the components at specific points around the circle, each one representing a concept the spell would manipulate. At the center, he placed a mirror. Because the spell required the caster to see themselves clearly at the moment of casting, Tharival began the incantation at midnight, speaking words in a language that predated human civilization, syllables that tasted of metal and ash on his tongue. The spell was long and complex, requiring nearly an hour to complete, each word building on the previous, each gesture adding another layer to the magical structure being constructed. He felt the power gathering around him, felt reality itself beginning to bend in response to his will. The components ignited one by one, burning with flames that were wrong colors, purple and green and shades that should not exist. The mirror at the circle's center began to glow, showing not Tharaval's reflection, but something else, images flickering too fast to fully perceive. He saw other versions of himself, other choices he might have made, other lives he could have lived. He saw the world as it was, and the world as it could be, infinite possibilities spreading out like branches from a tree. As the spell approached its climax, Tharaval felt doubt for the first time. The power he was wielding felt wrong. Not evil exactly, but fundamentally inappropriate. Like a child holding a weapon designed for gods, the images in the mirror were showing him consequences he had not anticipated, cascading changes that spread far beyond his intended targets. But he had come too far to stop, invested too much, and his pride would not allow him to fail. He spoke the final words of the incantation, the spell's name spoken backwards as required, his own true name inverted and offered to the magic as payment. The power that had been gathering suddenly focused, contracted into a single point of impossible density, then exploded outward like a star going nova. Tharaval screamed as the spell took effect, not from pain, but from sudden, absolute understanding of what he had done. The spell worked exactly as the fragments had promised. It reached out and touched reality, and reality changed in response. But the change was not what he had intended, not the controlled reshaping he had envisioned. The spell was too powerful, too fundamental, and he was too limited to direct it properly. Reality fragmented around him. His laboratory existed in multiple states simultaneously, present and past, and future overlapping in a single space. He saw himself as a child, as an old man, as a corpse, all versions real and occupying the same moment. He felt his body becoming unstable, his physical form struggling to maintain cohesion when the laws that governed matter had been rewritten. The worst part was his mind. The spell had promised to reveal hidden truths, to grant understanding of reality's underlying structure. It delivered on that promise, flooding Tharaval's consciousness with knowledge that mortal minds were never meant to comprehend. He saw how magic really worked, saw the true names of things that had no names, understood patterns and connections that linked everything in creation to everything else. The knowledge was too vast, too complex, too alien. His mind could not contain it, could not process it, began to crack under the weight of impossible understanding. He felt his sanity shattering like glass, felt the person he had been dissolving as new knowledge overwrote old identity. Tharaval tried to reverse the spell, tried to speak counter-incantations that would undo what he had done. But he had spoken his true name backwards, had given it to the magic, and without his name, he could not properly cast anything. The words came out jumbled and meaningless, powerless, just sounds without substance. The spell continued to spread outward from his laboratory, a wave of reality distortion that affected everything it touched. Objects in his tower began to exist in multiple states, simultaneously present and absent, solid and ethereal. The other wizards in the academy felt it, felt reality becoming unstable, and they responded with desperate speed. The Archmage herself, a woman named Syndra Wands, who had lived 300 years and seen horrors beyond counting, recognized immediately what was happening. She had read the same warnings Tharival had ignored, knew the signs of reality warping magic gone catastrophically wrong. She gathered every wizard in the academy, formed them into a circle, and began casting a containment spell of extraordinary complexity. The containment took 6 hours to complete, 6 hours during which Tharival's laboratory continued to hemorrhage broken reality into the surrounding world. By the time the containment locked into place, sealing the affected area away from normal space, the damage extended throughout the entire tower and into sections of the academy beyond. Tharival was trapped inside the containment, existing in the fractured reality he had created. Time did not flow normally there. Space folded back on itself. The laws of cause and effect were suggestions rather than rules. He was alive but not living, conscious but not sane, capable of thought but not coherent thought. The Academy sealed the entire tower, declared it forbidden territory, placed wards that would kill anyone who tried to enter. They struck Tharival's name from their records, not as punishment, but as mercy, because the thing that existed inside the containment was no longer the man who had been their colleague. His published works remained, for they were genuinely valuable, but all mention of their author was removed. Inside the containment, Tharival exists still, though time has no meaning in that fractured space. He experiences every moment of his life simultaneously, past and present and future collapsed into eternal now. He knows everything and understands nothing. His mind so full of impossible knowledge that there is no room left for self. Sometimes he remembers being a wizard, remembers ambition and pride, and the certainty that he knew better than those who had come before. Those memories are the worst, because they remind him that he did this to himself, that he was warned and ignored the warnings. The containment holds, but it requires constant maintenance. Every decade, the Academy's strongest wizards must renew the spells that keep Tharival's fractured reality from spreading. Each renewal is dangerous, for those who perform it must come close enough to the containment to feel its effects, must gaze briefly into the broken world within, and feel their own minds beginning to crack under the strain of impossible knowledge. The younger wizards ask why they do not simply destroy the containment, kill whatever remains of Tharival, and be done with it. The elders explain patiently that they cannot, that the spell Tharival cast was too fundamental, too deeply woven into reality's fabric. The containment is not holding Tharaval. It is holding the damaged reality he created. If the containment fails, the damage will spread, and there is no knowing how far it might go before it exhausts itself. So the Academy maintains its vigil, generation after generation, paying the price for one wizard's arrogance. They tell Tharaval's story to every new apprentice, though they no longer speak his name, referring to him only as the cautionary tale. They teach that magic has limits for good reason, that some spells were forbidden not out of fear, but out of hard-won wisdom purchased with blood and sanity. In Waterdeep, if you know where to look and who to ask, you can see the sealed tower from certain vantage points. It appears normal from the outside, just another tall structure in a city full of them, but those with magical sight report that it glows with sickly colors, that reality shivers and distorts in its vicinity, that sometimes screams can be heard emanating from within, though no sound actually escapes the containment. The forbidden spell that Tharaval assembled from fragments remains incomplete in the Academy's archives. The sections he found are kept separated now, stored in different secure vaults, each one guarded by multiple wards and physical locks. The archmages have debated destroying the fragments entirely, but they worry that doing so might somehow affect the containment, might free whatever remains of the wizard who cast the complete version. Some scholars speculate that Tharaval's spell was never meant to be complete, that the fragments were scattered deliberately by the spell's original creator, a wizard whose name was lost even in ancient times. Perhaps that wizard cast the spell and suffered consequences even worse than Tharaval's, and used their remaining sanity to ensure no one else could make the same mistake. Or perhaps the spell itself was a trap, designed to punish the arrogant wizards who believed themselves above the wisdom of their predecessors. The truth remains unknown, locked away with Tharaval in his prison of broken reality. And that may be for the best, for some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, some understanding too terrible to bear. The wizard who sought to reshape reality learned that reality has its own defenses, its own ways of punishing those who try to force it into shapes it was never meant to hold. Tharaval Darkweave wanted to be remembered as the greatest wizard of his age, the one who transcended all limitations and brought magic to its ultimate expression. Instead, he is remembered as a warning, a name that is not spoken, a cautionary tale told to ambitious apprentices who believe themselves smarter than those who came before. His spell worked exactly as intended, granted him exactly what he sought, and the price was everything he was and everything he might have been. In the hierarchy of magical disasters, reality warping stands alone as the most catastrophic. Summoning gone wrong might unleash demons, but demons can be banished. Necromancy taken too far creates undead, but undead can be destroyed. Even planar rifts can be sealed with sufficient power and knowledge. But reality itself, once broken, cannot be easily repaired, and the wizard responsible becomes part of the damage, trapped forever in the consequences of their own hubris. The sealed tower stands as a monument to the forbidden spell, to magic that should never have been spoken, to knowledge that should have remained scattered and incomplete, and inside, in a space where time and causality have no meaning. The thing that was once Tharaval continues to exist, simultaneously experiencing every moment of its eternal punishment, forever brilliant and forever damned, the living proof that some doors should never be opened, because what lies beyond is not wonder, but horror beyond all comprehension. Lore number 10, the Forgotten God. There are many ways for a god to die. They can be slain by other deities in conflicts that shake the foundations of reality. They can be consumed by greater powers, absorbed and unmade. But the cruelest death, the slowest and most terrible, is to be forgotten. For gods exist through belief, sustained by the worship and acknowledgement of mortals. When the last prayer is spoken, when the final temple crumbles, when even the memory of a deity's name fades from mortal minds, that God does not simply cease to exist. They linger, trapped in a twilight state between existence and oblivion, aware of what they have lost, but powerless to reclaim it. In the time before the current pantheon established dominance over Faerun, there were gods whose names are no longer recorded in any living tongue. These forgotten deities once commanded vast followings, received offerings in golden temples, answered prayers with miracles that shaped the course of history. They were as real and powerful as Torm or Mistra or Lathander, perhaps more so. But time is merciless even to immortals, and circumstances can conspire to erase even the mightiest beings from collective memory. One such god was known, in the final years when anyone still remembered, as the keeper of twilight hours, the deity of transitions and endings, of moments between one state and another. This god held dominion over the space between day and night, between life and death, between certainty and doubt. Mortals prayed to this deity during times of change, seeking guidance through transitions, asking for courage to let go of what was and embrace what would be. The keeper was neither good nor evil in the way mortals understand such concepts, but rather balanced, embodying the necessity of change itself. The gods' temples were built at crossroads, at river fords, at mountain passes, anywhere that represented transition from one place to another. The clergy wore robes that shifted color depending on the angle of observation. Gray that became silver, that became shadow. For thousands of years, the keeper of twilight hours was worshipped throughout the region that would eventually become the Heartlands. The god was not the most powerful deity, not the most widely worshipped, but the keeper held an important place in the pantheon, filled a necessary role. Every mortal faced transitions, experienced endings, stood at crossroads, both literal and metaphorical. The keeper's domain touched every life, and that connection sustained the god's power. Then came the Sundering, the great cataclysm that reshaped the world and nearly destroyed the pantheon entirely. Gods died or vanished, their portfolios scattered or absorbed by survivors. The Keeper of Twilight Hours survived the initial catastrophe, though diminished. But the aftermath proved more dangerous than the event itself. In the chaos following the Sundering, mortals sought certainty rather than transition, desired stability over change. They turned to gods who promised strength and protection, who embodied absolutes rather than the spaces between. The worship of the Keeper began to decline as mortals built new societies that valued permanence, that tried to resist change rather than navigate it gracefully. The Keeper's clergy tried to adapt, modified their teachings to emphasize the positive aspects of transition, the opportunities inherent in change. But mortals who had watched their world nearly end were not interested in embracing uncertainty. The temples emptied slowly, priests finding fewer and fewer petitioners seeking guidance. Some clergy converted to other faiths, following gods whose star was rising rather than setting. Others maintained their devotion, even as their numbers dwindled, believing that faith alone could sustain their deity. But faith alone was not enough. Gods draw power from active worship, from prayers spoken with conviction, from offerings made with genuine devotion. The Keeper of Twilight Hours felt the connection to the mortal world weakening, felt divine power draining away like water through cupped hands. The god tried to manifest, to perform miracles that would remind mortals of the need for a deity of transitions. But without sufficient power, the miracles were small and easily attributed to chance or luck, rather than divine intervention. The last temple dedicated solely to the Keeper of Twilight Hours stood in a town whose name has itself been forgotten, erased by time and successive conquests. The temple was tended by a single priest, an elderly woman named Meridia, who had served the Keeper for 60 years. She performed the daily rituals alone, speaking prayers to a god who no longer had the strength to answer, maintaining traditions that no one else remembered or cared about. Meridia knew her god was dying, could feel it in the way her prayers seemed to vanish into empty air, in the absence of the warm presence that had once accompanied every ritual. But she refused to abandon her faith, refused to let the Keeper slip into oblivion without witness. She had devoted her entire life to this deity, and she would maintain that devotion until her own death claimed her. The god appeared to Meridia one final time, manifesting as a figure of shifting shadows and silver light, barely substantial, more impression than physical form. The Keeper spoke in a voice like wind through autumn leaves, thanked Meridia for her faithful service, released her from her oaths. The god was fading, the Keeper explained, and there was no reason for Meridia to fade with her deity. She should convert to another faith, find a god who could answer her prayers, live out her remaining years in the comfort of genuine divine connection. Meridia wept and refused. She had given her life to the keeper of twilight hours, and she would not abandon her god at the end simply to preserve her own comfort. If the keeper was to be forgotten, then at least one mortal would remember until the very last. The god tried to argue, but divine power was nearly exhausted, the manifestation already fading. The keeper vanished like morning mist, leaving Meridia alone in the empty temple with her memories and her stubborn devotion. Meridia died 3 years later in her sleep, peacefully for a woman who had spent her final years in lonely vigil. She was found by travelers who had taken shelter in the abandoned temple, her body cold and still, a peaceful expression on her weathered face. They buried her in the temple garden, marking the grave with a simple stone, and then continued their journey without ever knowing they had laid to rest the last worshipper of a forgotten god. With Meridia's death, the final thread connecting the keeper of twilight hours to the mortal world was severed. The god did not die, not in any absolute sense, for divine beings exist beyond the simple binary of life and death. Instead, the keeper slipped into the space between existence and nothingness, trapped in eternal twilight that mirrored the domain the god had once commanded. In this state, the keeper remains aware, conscious of the vast emptiness where worshippers once existed, feeling the absence of prayers like phantom limbs. The god exists in all the transitional spaces of the world simultaneously, present at every crossroads, every threshold, every moment of change. But presence without power is a torment. Awareness without ability to act is a cage more confining than any prison. Sometimes, very rarely, mortals standing at crossroads report strange sensations, a feeling of presence just beyond perception, a whisper that might be wind or might be something more. Scholars of divine magic theorize these are echoes of forgotten gods, deities reduced to barely perceptible impressions, ghosts of immortals who once commanded the faith of thousands. The truly tragic aspect of the keeper's fate is that the domain the god represented did not disappear with the god's fading. Transitions still occur, endings still come, mortals still stand at crossroads, both literal and metaphorical. The need the keeper fulfilled still exists, but now it goes unmet, or is inadequately addressed by other deities whose primary focus lies elsewhere. The space the keeper occupied in the pantheon remains empty, a gap in the divine order that occasionally makes itself felt when transitions go poorly, when endings arrive without grace, when mortals face change without guidance. Some particularly learned sages whisper that forgotten gods can be restored if their names are recovered and spoken with faith, if temples are rebuilt and worship resumed, but the names are lost, erased so thoroughly that even the most ancient texts contain only references to titles rather than true names. And without a name, without any clear memory of what the forgotten deity represented. How can worship be restored? The keeper of twilight hours exists still in that terrible space between, watching mortals navigate transitions without divine assistance, feeling the prayers that are never spoken because no one remembers there was once a God to pray to. It is an existence without purpose, awareness without meaning, immortality transformed from blessing to curse. And the keeper is not alone. Throughout the forgotten corners of divine reality, other lost gods linger in similar states, deities of domains that once seemed important but fell out of favor, gods whose portfolios were absorbed by more successful immortals, entities whose names were deliberately erased by rivals who wished to eliminate competition. They exist in the margins, in the spaces between aware and suffering and utterly powerless. The forgotten gods serve as a reminder that immortality is not invulnerability, that even beings of vast power can be unmade through simple neglect. They are warnings written in divine essence, cautionary tales about the relationship between gods and mortals, about how belief sustains divinity and absence of belief condemns even the mightiest beings to slow dissolution. In dusty libraries, in texts that few scholars bother to read, there are references to these lost deities. Footnotes mentioning names that mean nothing, fragments of prayers addressed to entities that no longer answer. Occasionally, an archaeologist uncovers a temple to an unknown god, finds altars inscribed with symbols that match no current pantheon. These discoveries are cataloged, studied briefly, then filed away and forgotten again. And the god whose temple was momentarily remembered slips back into obscurity. The keeper of twilight hours represents all of these forgotten deities, stands as symbol for every god who once walked among the divine, and now exists only in the spaces between existence and oblivion. The story is not about one deity, but about the fragility of even divine existence, about how power that seems absolute can be eroded by simple forgetfulness, about how the most terrible fate is not destruction, but irrelevance. Mortals go about their lives, praying to the gods they know, building temples to deities whose names they can speak. And in the twilight spaces, in the moments of transition, the forgotten gods watch and remember what it was to be worshipped, to be needed, to matter. They exist as warnings that no power is permanent, no position is secure, and even immortals can be killed through the simple act of being forgotten. The last prayer to the keeper of twilight hours was spoken by Meridia in her final hour, a simple request for her god to find peace in whatever form that peace might take. The god heard, though lacked the power to respond, and that prayer echoes still in the divine twilight where forgotten gods dwell. A final gift from the last faithful mortal to a deity who exists now only in memory that has itself been forgotten. These tales we have shared tonight are fragments of a larger story, pieces of the endless narrative that is Dungeons and Dragons lore. They speak of choices made and prices paid, of transformations that could not be undone, of fates sealed by single moments of decision or desperation, from druids who loved too deeply to gods who faded into silence. Each story reminds us that consequences echo across time, that actions have weight, and that sometimes the greatest tragedies come not from evil, but from love twisted beyond recognition. If these stories have brought you comfort as you drift toward sleep, if they have given you glimpses into the lost corners of fantasy's greatest world, then perhaps you will return for more. Consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like on this video, sharing these tales with others who appreciate the deep lore, the forgotten stories, the whispered histories that make this world so rich and endlessly fascinating. There are always more stories to tell, more shadows to explore, more forgotten voices waiting to be heard. Until we meet again in another tale, in another shadow, sleep well and dream deeply.